Please be aware that this programme also contains themes of domestic violence.
It's unusual that a murder offence is captured on CCTV. Very harrowing.
Police boys, there's actually a dead body in the ditch.
Couldn't even recognise her. Black eyes. Everything was just basically swollen and bruised.
He's an animal. Really, he's destroyed my family.
He started like kicking me and punching me and I was terrified.
We had to take a dangerous offender off the street.
He's just evil. He's took a mother away from her 5 children. That's the monster.
Ten miles south of Birmingham lies the pretty Worcestershire village of Hopwood.
Hopwood is what I would describe as a rural area, lots of country lanes.
Very peaceful and tranquil. That's the kind of thing you'd expect from this kind of place.
You've got the canal down there, you've got a couple of nice pubs. It's just lovely.
It's a very sleepy village. There's obviously not much traffic coming around here. Everyone knows everybody in the village.
They look out for each other, they can go to each other to ask for help. It's a really tight-knit community.
But the peace of this rural idyll is about to be shattered.
Emergency, which service?
Police boys.
Police emergency.
Hello, yeah. Sorry, I'm just walking my dog up the lane at the moment. There's actually a dead body in the ditch.
Just before 6 a.m. on that morning, dog walker walking his dog in Wast Hills Lane, and the dog came across a pile of leaves. And the dog walker then discovered there was blood underneath the leaves.
I just saw a pile of blood on the road, and I thought, where's all that come from? And the dog's gone to a ditch, and I thought, oh, somebody's dumped rubbish. And then I could see an hand and a leg. I thought, oh, sorry.
It is the body of a woman in her 30s.
And obviously, that prompted an emergency response from police and the ambulance service.
To find a scene like that is incredibly shocking, especially in this area.
Might have been hit by a car.
I'm not sure. Can you get them as quick as you can?
Medics pronounce the woman dead, and it is deemed as a potential hit and run.
Upon receiving the report, the police attended the location and immediately set up a crime scene, preventing others from accessing the road, so that the investigations can begin into what had happened and how it had happened.
West Mercia's Detective Chief Inspector Jerry Smith heads up the investigation.
We're currently standing in Wast Hills Lane, in the actual inner cordon in the scene itself. The pool of blood was located around this area. And then what you actually had as well were drag marks in blood leading across the road, which was obviously where the body had been dragged to place it in the ditch. The body was covered in debris and vegetable matter. When I initially attended the scene, officers thought that it could have been a non-stop fatal road traffic collision.
The grim discovery becomes the talk of the village.
This must have been a huge shock for the local residents, finding out that a body had been discovered in their locality.
That kind of, concern, because this is a place where things don't happen very often, would have been high, really high level.
Everybody did talk about it, and we were all going, oh my God, was she walking? Because we used to walk down that a lot. We used to go a nice long walk down to the canal.
I was keenly aware that going forward it was highly likely to raise significant concerns within that area, particularly at that time because we didn't have an identification of the body and we didn't know what type of incident we were actually dealing with.
But investigators have their work cut out, trying to establish what actually happened and the identity of the motorist who potentially hit her, then drove off.
The rural nature of the scene obviously means that we're going to get less likelihood of CCTV evidence and witness evidence because, as you can see, there's nobody around, just causing complexities to the investigation.
The police carry out an immediate investigation. They will have spoken to witnesses at the houses nearby, knocking on doors to see if anybody had heard or seen anything at the time, as well as conducting painstaking CCTV inquiries to try and identify the movements of the deceased.
The next priority in an investigation like this is to identify the body, to work out who this woman is.
The police identified a rucksack at the scene. Inside that rucksack was a mobile phone.
Fingerprints and DNA swabs were taken from the phone, and then it was opened up and identification details from the handset, from the SIM were taken. And then by making inquiries with the telecommunications provider, we managed to identify through our intelligence systems that it was Kerry. Kerry Owen was a 35-year-old mother of 5 children. She was initially from the Peterborough area.
The first Kerry's family hear about her death is via her boyfriend, Alan Edney.
It was 27th of May, and I sat at home, and my son received a phone call saying Kerry died in a hit and run in Birmingham.
I was in my granddad's living room and he got the call and then he told me. He said that your mum has passed away. Everyone was just upset and shocked.
I got a phone call and he said to me that they were out camping and she ran off and got hit by a car and the car drove off.
And he says, we was running across the farmer's field and there was a gateway. He says, I think I thought I slipped and went through the gateway and I looked at the side of me and Kerry lay there with a hole in her head. And I see a black Peugeot 206 in the distance.
Obviously, I broke down, like, I was literally in tears. One of my sister's mates who I lived with, he broke down. He just hugged me and he goes, we're going to get justice for her one way.
Obviously, I was upset. You know, she's my friend. I've always looked out for her and I felt let down that I couldn't protect her because I've always been there to protect her.
She was a kind-hearted person. You know, she'd do anything for anybody.
She would always look after Kyrie, who's my oldest son, buy him new clothes, feed him, change him. They would always be together.
Everyone really loved her, you know, like she was just like adorable and that.
While Kerry's family try to come to terms with the devastating news, investigators are examining the scene to try to establish what actually happened.
In the addresses nearby, some of those addresses had CCTV and a vehicle had been seen leaving Wast Hills Lane at about 4 a.m. And relatively quickly, by attending a local address, we were able to work out that was highly likely to be somebody that lived at one of those addresses and that was going to work. We were subsequently able to find that car and just reassure ourselves there was no damage or blood or anything on that car consistent with a road traffic collision.
DCI Smith also has other concerns when he re-examines the scene.
I found it immediately unusual that anyone would have stopped in those circumstances and particularly made the effort to cover up blood and deposit the body in a ditch and then cover the body as well. The lack of any tyre marks, the lack of any vehicle debris, to me indicated that it was not a road traffic collision.
And officers speaking to local residents also suspect all is not as it seems.
During some of the initial witness trawling, people had heard voices in the road.
CCTV from a nearby address points towards the area in the lane where the voices are coming from.
It didn't cover the scene, but crucially what it did have was audio. At approximately 4:05 that morning, you start to hear voices. It's difficult to hear, but it's clear there's two people and that someone is distressed, and then gradually those voices turn into screaming. There's some significant instance of violence occurring at that time in the road, and that lasts for about 5 minutes. I wasn't dealing with a road traffic collision, and it was highly likely to be a homicide.
In Hopwood, Worcestershire, 35-year-old mother of 5, Kerry Owen, has been found dead by the roadside in mysterious circumstances. After viewing nearby CCTV just hours before her body is discovered, police now suspect Kerry was murdered as she walked along Wast Hill Lane.
You hear parents screaming, and then later on, we hear more screaming. This is particularly significant because of the gap between the screaming that you hear may indicate 2 separate attacks.
"40 metres before Kerry's final resting place, police uncover evidence of that first attack.
This is the scene of what I think could have been the initial attack site, with blood was found on the ground, and in fact a dislodged tooth was found in this area as well by the fingertip search. There was also some orange debris in the road. Officers thought it was a cigarette lighter, so straight away it became obvious there were 2 separate attack sites, 2 assaults. And that is then potentially corroborated by what you hear on the CCTV. There is a gap between the screaming, which may be consistent with an assault in one location, either Kerry moving herself or being dragged to the second location where she was finally killed.
When the post-mortem results come back, they reveal more about what happened to Kerry.
The pathologist found that Kerry had essentially been subjected to a savage beating. She had over 80 injuries on her body.
She suffered significant facial injuries. She had fractures to her nose. She had a tooth knocked out. She had a fracture to the hyoid bone in her neck. The injuries were terrible.
The final conclusion was that Kerry had died from blunt force trauma. Basically, she had been beaten to death.
We obviously had to identify her. You couldn't even recognise her. She was all swollen, she had black eyes, they'd had to shave all her hair off. Everything was just basically swollen and bruised.
She had a hole in her head. Obviously, I wanted to go and see her, and my niece, she was like, "Nah, don't, because it's going to scar you for life." She goes, "It's not a nice sight."
I just felt sick, you know, to think that how can somebody do that to somebody who won't even fight back? Kerry wouldn't have fought back.
The injuries are more consistent with a sustained attack. They aren't really consistent with a hit and run, so that's question marks over Alan Edney's story.
Her boyfriend's claims that she'd been hit by a black Peugeot 206 during their camping trip also don't add up.
If that happened to me, I'd be devastated. I'd be crying my eyes out. I'd be absolutely destroyed. He was so calm.
I thought it was a bit funny because I've known Kerry 21 years. Kerry doesn't do camping, you know, so I thought that seemed a bit strange.
I used to buy and sell cars and everything. I've never seen a Peugeot 206 black one in years. Must be a proper collector's car. It was unbelievable.
The last photos taken by Kerry's phone confirms the couple had indeed been camping in nearby woods. Officers seek out and find their campsite. But something else about Alan's story doesn't stack up.
Edney's account was that they had come from the campsite and for some reason decided to have a race. He'd got caught in the gate, and as that happened, he'd heard the sound of a collision and Kerry being hit by a vehicle, which didn't stop. And it just doesn't make sense that they would have climbed over this gate and she'd have been hit by a car. We're now hundreds of yards from the location where Kerry's body was found. The road traffic collision just didn't stand any scrutiny.
Alan Edney basically told some of Kerry's family members he had in fact called the police and an ambulance, and he had then attended a local hospital with Kerry where she was pronounced deceased.
He describes to his grandmother actually that he's had a statement taken by a police officer who had then dropped him back.
We found no evidence of any of that at all.
With Edney now firmly in their sights as a suspect, detectives dig deeper into his history with Kerry.
Kerry Owen first met Edney in March 2020 via a dating site.
I remember her saying to me she'd met a man on the internet from Birmingham.
And within a week, she moved to Birmingham with him.
First time we went down, we met him in the town centre and he seemed lovely.
I told her to really come back to Peterborough so she could be with her family, but she said no, she met the man of her dreams, basically.
All Kerry wanted in life was to be loved, and, you know, if somebody told her they loved her straight away, Kerry would be all for that, if you know what I mean. So she was sort of a bit vulnerable when it comes around relationships.
But barely a month into the budding romance, cracks begin to show.
She phoned me and told me that he was beating her up. And that's when I asked her, you know, to come back to Peterborough to her dad's house or come to my house. But, you know, she obviously stayed there.
She stayed in contact for a couple of months, then all of a sudden the phone calls stopped, Facebook stopped. I kept texting her, are you okay, are you okay? Nothing come back. We're worrying about her. Then the next thing, Kerry's texted me, she says he's in prison.
In 2021, there was a serious incident where Kerry and Alan's mum had taken a short holiday to Blackpool, and that resulted in a serious assault where Alan assaulted Kerry and his mum.
I think she rang me, she FaceTimed me and told me that he'd just been arrested, and she showed me her face and she had some, I think, some grazes or black eye. She had been in the hospital. She told me she'd been in the hospital. She had marks on her belly because he had stamped on her belly.
So I went there. That's when she told me as well she was pregnant with his baby.
For a man to assault his own mother and also assault his partner, especially when she's pregnant, kind of really paints the picture of the kind of man that Edney was, with this violent streak that ran through him.
I was obviously really shocked and I was confused as well because he was obviously acting so nice when we went to Birmingham. But I was confused.
She was still like sticking up for him. When you're in them kind of relationships, it's like kind of hard to like get out.
Edney is jailed for 6 months for the assault on Kerry and his mother.
She stayed in contact while he was in prison. It was like we'd got our niece back and the kids had got their mum back. Then all of a sudden the contact stopped again.
Unfortunately, Kerry did maintain contact with Alan when he was in prison. When Alan was released from prison, he rekindled his relationship with Kerry, and they in fact lived together. He assaulted her again, and he was in fact on bail not to contact her.
Detectives uncover more worrying incidents involving Edney.
I went down there on bonfire night and we all went round there, we done fireworks, and Alan got very drunk and my mum had told him to stop drinking. He obviously kicked off about it, and then Alan started screaming at my mum, calling her all different names. He was verbally violent to her. So we were like, okay, we're going home.
It is the last time Yasmin sees her mum alive.
I feel bad for leaving her, but I had to put my kid first in that situation. I can't expect my kid to be around that.
Having delved into Edney's history, police investigating Kerry's death make a decision.
The police, having conducted their initial investigations, it became clear that Edney was the person who they wanted to arrest for this offence.
Once we'd identified a location for him, an address on the nearby Hawksley estate that was within walking distance of the crime scene, was in fact his grandmother's address. When officers attended Alan's nan's address, Alan was present and he was arrested on suspicion of murder.
Police investigating the murder of mother of 5 Kerry Owen in Hopwood, Worcestershire, have arrested her partner, Alan Edney.
Edney was arrested on the evening of the 27th of May 2022. His family were entirely surprised at his arrest, given that they believed that Kerry Owen had died in a road traffic collision.
He didn't make any admissions. He, in fact, made no comment to all questions put to him during the interview process. But he did make comments outside of the process, indicating that he had an alibi and that he wasn't responsible for the offence.
Word spreads throughout the village and to Kerry's family back in Peterborough.
Police came round, my granddad's, and basically said Alan Edney has been arrested on suspicion of murder. It all made sense then, like it all adds up why he was lying, why people had been told different stories and stuff like that, and we all had to do our statements.
Meanwhile, police uncover more evidence about Edney's behaviour.
Our investigations into Alan Edney's history demonstrated that he had a significant history of domestic abuse on intimate partners, but also on his family members. There seemed to be a pattern where alcohol was a significant trigger for that offending behaviour. And we found a number of incidences in Alan Edney's past of significant domestic violence. One of those occurred on New Year's Day, 2018.
I was celebrating with friends. I came back and I heard my friend screaming. So I've gone all the way up, and she's opened up the door, bright red-faced. I went, "You're right." She went, "Yeah, just, like, come in." And then I was dragged into the bedroom. He started, like, kicking me and punching me, and I was on the floor. I did not do anything for him to do anything. It was just automatic kicking and punching. He was drunk. He'd been strangling her with a broom. You could physically see the broom was on the bed. At one stage I could get up so I could move because he went after her again. So I thought, this is my easy way to get out. But I went the wrong way. And I went towards the window.
The woman claims Edney then pushed her halfway out of the window as her friend looked on in horror.
Next minute I know is I'm looking down. Well, I was literally near enough out the window, and she literally dragged him back to pull me back in. I'd come back and he started kicking me again, but he was kicking me in the side, in the stomach, in the legs. My blood was all over the floor. My friend helped me try and get away. She shouted out, "She's pregnant." He went, "I don't care, another one can be dead then."
Edney's victim flees for her life. In March 2018, Edney pleaded guilty to assault and was jailed for 3.5 years.
To carry out an attack of that ferocity suggests a man with a serious violent tendency and where really there are no holds barred.
Mentally destroyed me. Physically destroyed me. I had to run from where I lived. Literally, I couldn't stay there. He was evil.
Following the attack, his victim posted warnings about Edney online, prompting his now girlfriend Kerry Owen to reach out.
Kerry then contacted me and my friend. We persuaded her. He'd beat her up. But because she was pregnant with his son, she was like, "Oh, I still love him." Next thing I know is that she's dead. And that absolutely killed me. Because nobody listened. This could have been prevented. I swear it could have been prevented.
With Edney in police custody being questioned over Kerry's death, her family visit the scene of her murder.
So we stopped the car, and then we went and laid, you know, like the flowers, but you could still see Kerry's blood on the road, and that's what got me, is like I had to walk away. Felt like she was there kind of thing.
And this man and lady pulled up in a car, and I said, "Do you know what?" I said, "Whoever found her must be destroyed." And this bloke says, "I didn't want to tell you, I'm the man who found her." And basically destroyed him.
What kind of person could just leave someone laid in the road? She's just been left in the middle of nowhere.
This Alan Edney, he's ruined everybody. You know, from the person who found her to our family. Really, he's destroyed my family.
With Edney refusing to answer police questions, detectives need to build a case against him. They continue trawling CCTV from local residents to piece together his movements leading up to the murder.
The CCTV inquiries were able to map the movements of Edney and Kerry Owen. It showed that they'd been together in the afternoon of the 26th of May.
For some reason, Alan and Kerry had decided to go camping in a wooded area near Wast Hills Lane. They had gone to the wooded area earlier in the daytime when it was light to set up the campfire, and there's pictures on Kerry's phone of a makeshift shelter and a lot of wood stacked up. They had then gone back to Alan's nan's address, had a meal, spent some time there, before then making their way back up Wast Hills Lane to the campsite. And there's in fact some CCTV footage of them making that journey around 10 p.m. They spent 3.5 to 4 hours at the campsite, and there's a number of photographs on Kerry's phone of Alan at the campsite with a very large fire. He's likely to have consumed a lot of alcohol on that night, and there was evidence of alcohol being consumed at that location. For some reason unknown, they decided to leave the campsite in the early hours of the morning.
At around 4 a.m, the sound of an argument breaks out between the couple on CCTV. Then Kerry is heard, fighting for her life.
It's a sustained attack for several minutes, and then it's silence.
Police then make a breakthrough. Their suspect is spotted on CCTV in broad daylight, alone.
Around 50 minutes later, the CCTV captured Edney leaving the locality of the scene.
Wearing a distinctive T-shirt that he's shown wearing on Kerry's mobile phone.
He's wiping his hands and he looks a bit agitated, he looks quite erratic, and he kind of walks down the lane, then turns off.
A search of Edney's home seals his fate.
When officers searched the address, there was a particularly significant find. The clothing that he'd been wearing on the night, the distinctive T-shirt with the motive on the front, tracksuit bottoms and trainers, which we could see on the CCTV video and also on Kerry's mobile phone photograph. That was found in a bin bag behind a cupboard in the kitchen area of the address.
The bag of clothes appear to have blood on them.
The police submitted the clothing that had been hidden by Edney for DNA analysis, and the blood on that clothing was found to be Kerry Owens.
Everything is starting to come together for the police in their investigation.
3 days after Alan Edney was arrested on suspicion of the murder of Kerry Owen, the Crown Prosecution Service made the decision to charge him with murder.
In Hopwood, Worcestershire, Alan Edney has been charged with the murder of his girlfriend, mother of 5, Kerry Owen. But the hard graft doesn't stop for the investigators.
Even though Alan Edney had been charged with murder, I'd say that the period leading up to a trial does involve an element of nervousness on behalf of the investigation team. There's a lot more detailed work that has to be completed to get the case ready for trial.
The police will still carry on trying to gather as much evidence. They're still pursuing anything they can to really kind of seal this case.
We had employed a number of forensic experts in the case. One of those was an odontologist. By ensuring a detailed fingertip search of the scene, we'd managed to find a tooth, and the odontologist was able to mechanically fit that tooth into Kerry's jaw to show that her tooth had been knocked out during the assault. Linear marks were found on Kerry's face. I was concerned that could have meant there was a weapon that had missing, because we were never able to get any support from a forensic expert that Alan Edney's wear was what had left those marks on her face. But ultimately there was not any evidence of a weapon being used, and it's likely that he'd used his hands and feet as his weapons.
The CPS and the police think it's built up a really strong case against Edney, but it's now over to the lawyers and for the case to go to court.
I was in a really bad way. My head was like all over. It was like I couldn't sleep, yeah, because it was like, is he gonna get found like guilty? Is he gonna like, or is he gonna walk? I didn't know what was gonna happen and that.
Kerry's family come face to face once again with her killer.
I was nervous, and then obviously during the court case, I was even more nervous. He was just sitting there, giving me like evil looks.
I just stared at him. You know, if looks could kill, he'd have been dead. Just to let him know, like, he might have took my niece's life, but he's not took the rest of ours. Do you know what I mean?
My sister, he was laughing in her face in the court, like he just didn't care.
There was just no remorse or sadness whatsoever when this is a woman who's had your baby. He had no remorse for what he'd done.
The court hears the harrowing evidence of Kerry's last moments.
They did say, we're about to play it. If you would like to leave the room, then leave.
The last time I ever heard my niece screaming for her life was on that man's CCTV. So, it's horrible, really. And then you get told in the court he was still kicking her and beating her after she was dead, basically. So he must have beat her to a pulp.
His defence at court was effectively that he admitted responsibility for Kerry's death, but that was on the grounds of provocation and diminished responsibility. Edney's defence was essentially that Kerry had brought up on the night issues around him being abused himself as a child, and then that had provoked him into acting the way he did.
Edney blames his brutal attack on mental illness and a loss of control.
The psychiatrist agreed that Edney suffered from a mental abnormality. However, we were able to prove that that abnormality of mind did not contribute towards his behaviour on that day. Part of the evidence put forward was the previous assaults upon both Kerry Owen and other partners. That helped us prove to the jury that Edney knew what he was doing when he killed Kerry Owen.
The prosecution also outlines how calm and collected Edney was in the aftermath of the crime, and how he spent time covering his tracks.
At that time of year in May, leaf matter would have been readily available. He used some of that to cover up a significant pooling of blood in the middle of the road, but then he also dragged Kerry's body into a deep ditch nearby, deposited her in there, and then covered her with a significant amount of vegetation which he took from undergrowth nearby. It was really important for the prosecution to paint a detailed picture of the web of lies, the accounts that he provided to his own family and Kerry's family, and we didn't find any evidence to show that Kerry was likely to have provoked him to violence in that way.
In fact, Edney hadn't lost his control. He knew exactly what he was doing.
It was in the hands of the jury from that point.
I think there's always an element of nervousness.
You do not know how the jury view the case, so naturally there is an apprehension. The jury unanimously found Edney guilty of murder.
We were all well happy. We were all jumping up and down on the seating area. We were all bouncing up and down on there, shouting. We were all happy.
I think the overwhelming emotion was one of relief that we had delivered justice for Kerry Owen, her family, and also to help to protect the wider public from Edney.
Alan Edney is jailed for life with a minimum of 20 years.
He is, in my view, a significant danger to women, and I think that result protects other women from potentially becoming similar victims.
It ensures that Edney will be behind bars for a very long time.
Justice was served, but I don't think the sentence was hard enough. It's basically probably destroyed our family. The man's evil.
He's took a mother away from her 5 children. That's a monster. Hopefully he'll never get out. You know, the best thing to him to do is die in jail.
The murder is forever etched in the memory of the village of Hopwood.
It will have a lasting impact on this community. It's such a horrendous crime on their doorstep in such a, what is otherwise a lovely place to live. And that will be with them for a long time.
For the people who live there, you know, this is kind of a blot on their history and something that I don't think any of them will forget.
But it's Kerry's family in Peterborough who are left to pick up the pieces.
When someone's took away from you instantly, so young, it's so hard, I think, to carry on.
There was some harsh moments, you know, where I tried taking my life. It's like I just wanted to like be with her because I basically like lost her, and not just like a sister, it's like a best, you know, like a best friend, and like I just like miss her and that.
So it's sad, really. It's sad for them all. She's, you know, missed by everyone.
She never got to meet my youngest kids. My kids can't now grow up the way they were growing up. Now it all has to change because she can't be there.
Even the grandchildren, they always look in stars and say, Nanny. It's just heartbreaking, really.
Two brutal killings, a massive manhunt, and it shocked the whole town.
The officers went to the 7th floor flat, saw this man holding a sawn-off shotgun. He went over the balcony and then dropped down floor by floor. The press in London called him Spider-Man.
On the night of January the 23rd, 1995, Lancashire police were called to a garage in Morecambe. What they discovered there could have been the scene from a horror film. The investigation into what turned out to be a brutal double murder and the ensuing manhunt for the killer would take the police all over the country. It was a case that the police and the people of Morecambe would never, ever forget. In January 1995, Morecambe, a picturesque seaside town in Lancashire, was about to become front-page news when the dead body of a man was found. DCI Graham Gooch from Lancashire Constabulary was to lead what would become an unprecedented investigation.
On the night in question, I was the duty on-call senior investigating officer, but sound asleep in bed, and then about 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone went, which means something awful's happened somewhere. So I took the call and they said they'd had a murder at Morecambe.
The officers had been faced with a gruesome scene at a garage on the Whiteland industrial estate. The dead body had been severely battered.
They tell you basically what's happened, and then you start thinking, what am I going to need? Where shall I rendezvous with the officers on the scene? And start the process rolling.
DCI Colin Mooney was appointed as Deputy Senior Investigating Officer on the case, an unusual one for this normally quiet holiday resort.
Morecambe's quite a low crime area to live in, particularly compared with other areas of Lancashire. It's got a great beach, and it's got the estuary. There's a famous walk across the Morecambe Bay, a guided walk.
It's not the big razzmatazz of Blackpool, no big rides and things like that, but it has its own lovely appeal. The Queen Mother once came to Morecambe and described Morecambe's view as a $65,000 view.
I would say Morecambe's probably one of the very safest places to live. It's sort of like a bit of a sleepy town. There's not really that much horrendous trouble, you know.
The wives of 49-year-old Tony Morocco and 29-year-old Paul Sandham had phoned the police, worried about their husbands who had worked at the garage together and not returned home.
They were creatures of habit. They'd finish their work about 5 o'clock and go home. And this night, they hadn't. The officers went to the garage with the relatives, and it was locked. And then they found somebody who's got a key to come along and unlock it. So the premises were locked. And inside, then they'd found this scene of destruction. Clearly, it looked as though someone had been playing dodgems with the cars, and there was smashed office furniture, smashed cabinets. And on the floor was the body of Tony Morocco.
Tony's body, unfortunately, bore considerable marks of violence. It looked as though he'd been stabbed and that his head had suffered a number of blows from a blunt instrument.
Well, certainly the amount of violence used was far in excess of that was needed to actually bring about death. There was something very emphatic about it, almost as if the person was acting out, I know, some sense of mission or getting revenge.
From his injuries, it was immediately clear to police that Tony Morocco had been brutally murdered on the premises of his own business. After pathologists had analysed the scene, his body was carefully removed, and along with crime scene investigators, DCI Gooch tried to figure out what had happened.
Left at the scene, there was a lot of blood there. There was a torque wrench, which had blood and traces of body on it and hair, so that appeared to be a fairly obvious murder weapon. And lots of other pieces, because garages are generally fairly messy places, so there's a lot of stuff to look at. But then here we had the feature of this car, this Toyota car, which had obviously crashed into the desk and into the cupboards. So clearly that was part of whatever had happened at the scene. So we knew that we have to do a lot more investigation into that. But of course the first thing on your mind is, who did this?
The police didn't have to look far for their first suspect.
The situation we had was these two men who worked together in the garage. They hadn't come home. We've been along there and we found the body of one of them and the other man's missing. It's not unreasonable to have some suspicion that they'd fallen out and had a terrible argument and that this was the result of it. Because, I mean, Paul Sandham was nowhere to be found. He hadn't gone home, which was most unusual.
The police immediately focused on locating Paul Sandham.
Officers have been called out to come to Morecambe to start forming an investigation team. In the morning, those officers had turned up about 8, 9 o'clock, And we'd started the briefing, painting the scene for them to tell them what was going on, what we were going to do, and what each of them would be doing. And then, during that briefing, in came one of the officers saying, "Hang on, boss, I think there's been a development," and hands me a piece of paper saying the body's been found further, just out in the countryside, a little way from Morecambe. And then we found out that that was Paul Sandham, who had been stabbed many, many times.
The man police had been treating as a suspect had been left for dead with 41 knife wounds.
There was a clear connection between the two victims, and also the level of violence used on both of them was quite similar. It did bring into focus the fact that there had been a deliberate separation of the two victims, which of course highlighted just how calculated it was.
At this point, then, we realised that we had a double murder on our hands. It was inconceivable that two people who worked so closely together, who went missing at about the same time, and both found murdered, would not be linked.
I've dealt with murders before with more than one victim. They don't come very often, but it does change things completely from what we were looking at before. Before, we were looking for possibly a murder with a reasonable suspect. Now suddenly you've got a double murder with no suspect. And it was a great concern to local people.
I spent most of my working life on the estate from being the age of 13. You know, I got to know Tony, you know, just through, you know, being on the estate like I got to know everybody else. He was a lovely guy. If anybody was going to say, you know, put Tony in a room of 10 other people, you know, who would get murdered, you know, you wouldn't put Tony, you'd say, well, what's he doing here? It was that shocking that, you know, it was just beyond belief, really.
The local press, the local radio, everybody was covering this big story, which was very helpful because it was a big story.
We've got here two brutal killings, a massive manhunt, something the like of which Morecambe had never seen before. And we were in the centre of it, being the town's newspaper, and we were swept up by it, and without a doubt we realised the enormity of the story and that we had to rise to this challenge.
Lancashire police had two dead bodies on their hands and no idea who could have committed the murders. The most dramatic investigation they had ever been faced with was about to commence. Police in Morecambe were dealing with a brutal double murder and no suspect. The body of Tony Morocco had been found at his garage business, and his co-worker Paul Sandham was found a mile down the road in a field. He'd been stabbed 41 times.
When people learned of what had happened to Tony and Paul, it was just pure shock. Or anybody on the estate could quite believe what had happened. It was unreal, just unreal.
Tony Morocco was very well known. He had a wide circle of friends and a big customer base. His partner Paul probably was lesser well known, but he'd obviously known to all the customers.
Sad thing for Paul. Paul had just recovered from cancer. You know, had gone through a grueling time with that. You know, to have his life pulled away from him in one flash of it, you know, it was absolutely shocking.
After speaking to friends and family, police started investigating Tony's business, hoping to find a clue that would lead them to the murderer.
The kind of work that Tony was involved in, the purchase and sale of low-value vehicles, indicated to us that it was largely a cash business, but there was no cash found on the body. So we did some checks, and we were right that there should have been some cash there. It looked like a robbery might have been the motive. In addition to that, Mrs. Morocco was able to tell us that Tony had a heavy gold chain around his neck, which he never took off, I think for sentimental reasons, except for just one occasion when he'd broken a link and it was repaired by a local jeweller. And that was missing as well.
Armed with their evidence, police began building a picture of what could have happened on that fateful night.
It became apparent to us that Paul Sandham had been taken away and murdered first. We guessed that this Toyota car had been used to take him away, presumably on a test drive. And he killed him in the field and then come back in the Toyota and crashed it into the garage when he arrived. We tend to assume that he'd gone along there, found two members of staff there, which he thought he couldn't overcome them. So on the pretext of wanting to buy a car, had got Paul Sandham away and killed him so he could go back and rob Tony.
Regardless of their theory, police still needed concrete evidence that the murders were linked and the Toyota car was significant.
It's very important to isolate the two scenes to make sure there's no contamination, because we wanted to find out if that car had been in the field. So we found next to the road, we got a tyre track, which eventually found matched the Toyota, but also, more importantly, we found soil of identical makeup in the footwell of the car as was in the entrance to the field. Now, the important thing was this was found on the driver's side and not the passenger's side. So it showed only one person who had been out of the car got back into it, and that was the driver. And that had gone back to TM Motors.
For me, more significantly, there was a trainer mark in mud in the field close to Paul Sandham's body. And there was also a similar trainer mark in blood in TM Motors. So it was clear to us that the murders were linked, and they feel the trainer mark was a definite scientific link between those two murders.
With the crashed Toyota car left at the garage, police needed to establish how the killer had travelled around.
One of the lines of inquiry which we had was to try to establish whether or not there was a getaway vehicle involved and whether or not anybody had seen it. The only thing that we could find out was that somebody dimly recalled seeing a pedal cycle propped up against the wall outside TM Motors. And to be honest, I don't think that the police put a great deal of store by that at the time, because who goes to commit a murder on a pedal cycle?
One of the members of staff of the garage who worked there part-time came in to help us, and he checked to see that all the cars were there, and he found there was one missing. And this was a white MG Metro, which was probably the best of the bunch of cars that were in the garage, and that one was missing. Not only was the car missing, but also the paperwork, the logbook and the receipts and that for the vehicle. So clearly the murderer had not only just taken the car as a getaway, he'd also made sure he got all the documents for it. So clearly he probably intended to move the car on later, and that was important to us. I mean, it tells you a lot about the person you're looking for, that this isn't somebody who's just done something on the spur of the moment. The fact that he's lured one man away to kill him just so he can go back and do a petty robbery shows this is a dangerous and determined person.
DCI Gooch had another suspicion about the murderer's connection to the crime scene.
Did he know the garage? Had he been there before? You take the idea, he wouldn't have come from a million miles away. It's fairly tucked away on the White Lund estate. It's something somebody local would have known, or somebody who knew the area very well. You wouldn't have just turned up there from a long way away and gone there on spec.
With the white Metro missing, they now had a vehicle to look out for. The car was placed on the police national computer as a vehicle of interest and also flagged with other relevant organisations.
There is an organisation which members of the public and car dealers can use to check whether or not a vehicle is stolen. We contacted that organisation and asked that if anybody checks that vehicle with them, that they should tell us, but not tell them.
So Having put a marker for the MG Metro onto HPI, only a couple of days later, they called us to say that someone had gone into a garage in Erith in southeast London to sell the car.
The hire purchase information alert was an important breakthrough, but this meant geographically the investigation had to expand 275 miles down south.
Very quickly, we sent a team down to London to check this out. And the man in the garage did a few second-hand cars, he did repairs and lower end of the market sort of cars. And he remembered the man who had taken in, because he'd done a few deals with him before. And he checked it and there was nothing outstanding on HPI at that time. So a deal was done and he part exchanged it for a Ford Escort.
The Erith car dealer provided an accurate description of the man that had sold him the white Metro, but wasn't much more help to the police as the suspect had covered his tracks.
He'd given false particulars, which gave us something to look at, but essentially it looked like a bit of a dead end. We didn't have any more information to go on then.
Unfortunately, and perhaps alarmingly, the car dealer had traded on the MG Metro, but luckily for us, he knew where it was, and we were able to catch up with the vehicle pretty soon thereafter. And so we seized it, we brought it back to Lancashire and had it examined by our scientific officers. They found traces of blood on the driver's door handle, and it would have been reasonable to expect that it was either Mr. Morocco or Mr. Sandhams, but it wasn't. This was the blood of a third person. And we began to speculate that perhaps in the frenzied attack on the two deceases, maybe, just maybe, the murderer had cut himself, and that this was, in fact, the murderer's blood.
It was looking like a DNA breakthrough. All police needed was a match.
Another important element that came in then was the car that he'd bought from the dealer in Erith, because we had the registration number for that. And then we found, by putting that on the police national computer, we found the car had been stopped in the City of London. Now, what was happening at that time, there was anti-terrorist procedures. Now, the officer who stopped him couldn't actually remember it, but we knew it was near one of the CCTVs that was part of what they call the Ring of Steel around the City of London at the time. Now, when we got that film back, there was the car with a man driving it. Now, the pictures were a bit fuzzy, not good enough to identify, but we noticed that the hand on the steering wheel appeared to be bandaged.
Using the description supplied by the Erith car dealer, the police released a sketch of the suspect to the national press, hoping it might trigger more leads.
After we'd released the artist impression, I got a phone call in the major incident room from a detective from the Kent Constabulary. And he told me quite definitively, "Here, Gov, I think I know who did your murders." And the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This sounded like a breakthrough.
There appeared to be a link with a man who'd been robbing jewellery shops in Kent.
There was some CCTV footage of one of the robberies where the offender was particularly and gratuitously violent towards the shop assistant, punching her in the face when there's absolutely no need to do that. DC Cullen was one of the officers involved in that investigation. He told me that he thought the person responsible for our murders was a man by the name of Terence Derrick Clifton.
Clifton was a suspect in the robberies, and having seen the artist's impression of the man Lancashire police were trying to track down, DC Cullen had thought the resemblance uncanny.
We did some quick checks on the name and the date of birth provided to us by Dick Cullen, and I was delighted to find that Clifton had a conviction in Lancashire, but not just Lancashire, Morecambe. This clearly made a connection between a man who lived in the southeast London area and sleepy old Morecambe in Lancashire.
I think when the link was made with the earlier crimes, the robberies of the jewellers, for example, it became apparent that this was an individual who was on the fringes of society, who seemed to see himself as outside the law. Somebody who's very much playing by his own rules, maybe with his own sense of purpose.
Armed with their new evidence, the police moved quickly. The hunt was on for Terry Clifton. In their search for a double killer, Lancashire police had identified a prime suspect. All they needed to do now is find him. Intelligence pointed to a man called Terence Clifton for the murders of Tony Morocco and Paul Sandham. But they were yet to track Clifton down and still needed evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime.
Now, one of the important things is on Tony Morocco's body, there was an awful lot of blood. And when they looked at his trousers, they'd taken blood samples from about 6 sites, which is the normal thing to do. And they'd all been the same blood group and they'd all been Tony's blood. However, they went back to it then and looked inside the pocket where his money would have been. And inside the pocket, another blood sample was taken, and that turned out that that wasn't Tony's. So suddenly, here we had the blood sample from the murderer, we thought. So now the case is really building up. We've got this suggested name from the intelligence officer in Kent. We've got a description that would appear to be matched. And now we've got blood from the murderer in the pocket of the deceased. So now we've got to match it.
Clifton had been in prison before, but this was 1995, when personal profile details held on convicts were limited.
Nowadays, it's quite routine for people coming into custody to have a mouth swab taken with a view to having their DNA recorded on the National DNA Database. But that wasn't the case way back then. So what we needed was a sample of Clifton's blood to compare with the blood of the third person from the crime scenes and from the MG Metro.
The investigation was now a nationwide search, and Lancashire police gathered as much support as they could without naming their suspect.
We always enjoyed a pretty good relationship with the police, and on this particular incident, it was outstanding, because partly the police needed us as well to help catch the guy.
We decided to release the artist's impressions to the local paper, and that brought about another development. A young lady came to the police station and she said that based on the artist's impression, she thought that the person that we were looking for was none other than Terence Clifton. She explained that Terence had attended school in the area and, significantly, that he had been in the Morecambe area around the Christmas and New Year period of 1995. The witness went on to say that, that Clifton had arrived in the area in a big old BMW car that he'd driven up from London, but that he had sold it and bought another car locally. And it came as no surprise that that transaction took place at T&M Motors. In fact, the BMW was still lying in the yard at T&M when we went to check.
He'd gone to trade this old car in, and he wasn't happy that Tony had only given him a couple £100 for it or something like that. But then he wanted money because there was petrol in the tank. And Tony took out his big wad of money and peeled off a fiver and said, "Yeah, there's £5 for the petrol." And he very much resented that.
The police now had an additional motive for the murders: revenge.
So the woman who went into Morecambe Police Station to say she'd seen Clifton and knew him was able to tell us that he'd stayed with a family in Morecambe the night before the murders. And when we saw them, they were able to tell us, yes, he'd stayed there the night before.
The people that Clifton had been staying with were also able to say that one day he came out onto the street where his car was parked to find that the tyres had been slashed, and he was extremely annoyed. He turned to his schoolmate, the person he'd been stopping with, and asked to borrow his pedal cycle, saying that he was going to go down to the Whiteland estate where he knew a couple of blokes who were going to sort him out a motor. This, of course, explained why no car was seen at T&M Motors and explained the presence of a pedal cycle propped up against the door at the relevant time. A little while later, Clifton appeared back at the family home. Then he was driving a white hatchback car, and the pedal cycle belonging to the young man with whom he'd been staying was sticking out the back. So he returned the pedal cycle and set off, saying that he was bound back for London.
Police confiscated the bike for forensic testing, where blood was found that matched that on the white Metro and in Tony Morocco's pocket. But they couldn't connect this blood to their suspect.
So we're obviously waiting for a DNA match to see whether or not we could definitively tie that blood to Terence Derek Clifton, but at that stage we didn't have it.
The police could only get the blood test they needed if they were able to arrest Clifton.
We'd already had officers down in London after the initial call, but now we sent more of a team down there to try to find him. And it was becoming very difficult. He certainly didn't make it easy for us. He was changing cars almost daily. And then he was moving from place to place where he was staying, and we always seemed to be a bit behind him.
I get a sense of a continuing theme of him versus the world. Him seeing himself as this character, almost a heroic character who can rise above adversity and demonstrate, in some respects, a superiority. He can give the police the runaround and get away with pretty much what he chooses.
When it was a bit of a manhunt to London, well then you think, Jesus, help me catch him. Everybody was sort of like shocked and look, you know, it was very hard for everybody. I mean, you know, it's all right for me to sit here saying it was hard. Imagine what his family felt like.
At this point, Lancashire Constabulary had officers at a police station in Bexley Heath in Kent, and they also had backup from the Metropolitan Police.
The murder investigation was turning into a manhunt. He was always giving an alias, but there's a common theme to those aliases.
Whilst he was going around giving people false names and addresses to people who didn't know him, there were clues in it for us, because a lot of the names he was given were sort of mix and match of places he'd lived before and people who he had known or relatives. At one of the addresses at which he'd stayed, we found a gold Belcher chain which he'd swapped for some cannabis. And we were able to take that to a jeweller in Lancaster who had repaired it, and he was able to identify it as being the chain he'd repaired for Tony Morocco.
Then the manhunt suddenly turned a corner, when on the 27th of February 1995, 1 month into the investigation, police pursued a lead in Erith in Kent.
Well, the officers went to the 7th floor flat of one of Clifton's ex-girlfriends, because we had reason to suspect he was there. So as they were going through the front door, the officer who was down on the ground saw Clifton backing out of the flat and holding a sawn-off shotgun, pointing in towards the flat. So we've now gone up a stage because he's armed and we know he's dangerous. But then he put the gun down and went over the balcony and then dropped down floor by floor. He just let go on each floor and dropped, and then just grabbed the railing of the flat below to slow himself down. And he did that all the way down to the ground, and then he ran off. After that, the press in London called him Spider-Man, and that was it.
I think part of my feelings at the time was I wish he'd fell off that tower block halfway down. You know, the man was a psychopath.
The police recovered the discarded shotgun, but now knew Clifton had access to firearms. He was now a huge danger to the public, and he was on the run.
Then we took the unusual step of publicising his name. Normally you don't publish the names of suspects until somebody's charged. But with this man on the loose and being so dangerous, we had to do that in the hope that people would come forward and tell us where he is, because nobody wants him on the loose in their community, because if he can do this sort of thing, he might do the same to them.
It was unnerving because the sheer brutality of it kept people on edge. They'd never known anything like it before. Somebody capable of doing that was capable of doing anything.
Two grieving families, a community on guard, and an armed killer. It was more urgent than ever. The police were closing in on Terence Clifton, who they believed had killed Tony Morocco and Paul Sandham in cold blood.
The London team had been chasing down the long chain of cars that Clifton had been buying and selling on. And they were hot on the trail of one particular car when they identified it parked up in a street. So the Metropolitan Police firearms team and Lancashire officers kept a watch on the car. And a man came to the car and got in. He was immediately surrounded by the armed officers and was arrested at gunpoint. Unfortunately, it wasn't Clifton. It was, however, a man who'd bought the car from Clifton only a number of hours previously. And once he'd been dusted down, he was able to tell us that, and to tell us the car that Clifton had bought off him. We were now only hours behind our suspect.
Clifton was reported to be driving an Austin Montego.
Now, in possession of information that he was in the Montego motor car, there were a number of officers plotted up in the area, and then two officers saw him get into the car, and then he went round and parked up in Finstead Road. It was called in, and the armed team then went in, and he was arrested. He surrendered straight away.
Finally, they'd got Clifton. Arrested at gunpoint on the 6th of March 1995, 6 weeks after the murders.
We had him now. And so it's a great relief that this man's no longer on the streets. He's a very dangerous man, and he's now locked up. So that was a huge relief. But then, you see, the job from my end of things particularly is really just starting, because now you've got to put all that evidence together to turn it into a case of admissible evidence.
When news of the arrest came through, it came as a relief to us, and I think also to our readers and obviously the families, that we were able to print the fact that finally this person the police have been looking for so long and who had been involved in so many escape dramas had finally been arrested, and that we were getting somewhere.
Police needed to prove that blood found on the stolen white Metro, the pushbike connected to the crime, and in Tony Morocco's pocket, belonged to Clifton. They took DNA swabs from him and awaited the results.
Yes, having been arrested down in London, then obviously he had to be brought up to Lancaster, where he was held. And we questioned him, and he thought he could be cleverer than us, if you like, because he was told briefly what the evidence was. And he said he happened to be walking through the White Lund Industrial Estate, like you do, and he'd seen this car parked at the roadside, the white Metro, with the keys in it and all the documents lying on the seat. And he just intended to steal the car. And that was his defence.
He was rational, he was polite, he admitted the theft of the MG Metro, but claimed that he had nothing to do whatsoever with the murders. So, following the interviews, we decided that we were going to charge him, notwithstanding the fact that we didn't have the DNA evidence at that stage. We did feel that we had sufficient evidence to charge, and we did.
Clifton was remanded in custody while he awaited trial, and several weeks later the results of his DNA swab came through, which, as police suspected, was a match with DNA evidence from the double murder.
We had this man with a history of extreme violence. We had a man who knew the area, despite the fact he had a London address. He'd been to school in Morecambe. He was known to be in the area. He'd borrowed a bicycle to go to the garage and had come back later with the white Metro, with the bicycle in it, with blood on it, which was his blood. Then we had his blood in Tony Morocco's pocket at the scene. We then had footprints at the scene of that murder and at the scene of Paul Sandham's murder. We could link the two scenes again because of the earth from the field and the earth in the driver's footwell of the Toyota that Clifton had then driven back to the garage. We've got the Belcher chain that was found in London that he'd swapped for some cannabis, which we could then identify positively as being Tony Morocco's. So we got an awful lot of evidence to make a case for the prosecution.
So in the next few months, Clifton made a number of appearances, both at the Crown Court and at the Magistrates' Court, as part of the process leading towards his eventual trial. His behaviour had deteriorated from that at the time of his interview. He assaulted a prison officer on one occasion and blew raspberries at the judge on another occasion.
On Saturday, the 24th of June 1995, Clifton was due to be formally committed for trial at Lancashire Magistrates' Court.
And then we came to the worst of all in his behaviour. He said he wanted private consultation with his solicitor, which he is entitled. So was taken into a room with his solicitor. Then he produced a sharpened telescopic car aerial, which he'd secreted within his rectum before he left prison, and then held this against his solicitor's throat and threatened him and took him hostage.
We called in a hostage negotiator, and we also called in officers who were trained to put an end to a siege like this by more forceful means.
I remember getting a call from a colleague at quite an early hour of the morning to say that there was an incident in progress at Lancaster Magistrates' Court. At that time, I worked for the prison service, and I was on call for hostage negotiation situations.
Dr. Need made his way to the court, while Lancashire police tried to manage the situation as best they could.
As part of this siege, he called for an imam to come and speak to him, claiming that he was a convert to Islam, and the imam duly came and spoke to him and declared that, in his opinion, he wasn't a convert.
When I arrived, everybody was rather tired, but above all, I think, attention focused on the well-being of the hostage.
The siege itself, from the time we took him, lasted for some 21 hours. So it's gone on a long time. And of course, when you're dealing with somebody like that, who's not that well balanced and clearly dangerous, as time goes on, they're getting tired, and either they give up or they can get worse and worse. At the end, things were getting worse, and that's why there had to be a rapid intervention.
It was decided that we should explore the possibility of tactical intervention, and that really centred upon separating Clifton from the hostage. And that was achieved by offering Clifton a cup of coffee, which he accepted and took a few steps over to reach for it. And at that point, the door to the room burst open and several gentlemen jumped on him. So it was brought to a peaceful resolution.
It was erratic behaviour, and it may have been just part of the delaying tactics. I'm not sure what he felt that he had to gain by taking his solicitor hostage. It seemed to me to be the last turn of the card of an increasingly desperate man.
Clifton's troublemaking continued. He sacked his defence lawyer and told police he would represent himself. The trial at Preston Crown Court didn't happen for 2 years.
So eventually he came up for trial in January of 1997. And then when it came to the day of trial, he refused to come out of the cell and face his own trial.
Because Clifton was unrepresented, it meant that the witnesses were not cross-examined, although the judge maintained the impartiality of the trial by asking pertinent questions of the witnesses himself. But nonetheless, the pace of the trial was much quicker than you would normally expect, and I recall that on one occasion, in excess of 30 witnesses in one day were heard.
At the trial, the injuries sustained by Tony Muraco were so bad, it took the pathologist like 45 minutes just to describe the injuries, and the family sat through all that.
The jury didn't take a long time at all to convict him of the murders. In a matter of 40 minutes or so, they'd returned unanimous verdicts of guilty to 2 offences of murder and 1 of the theft of the white MG car.
All that was left was to sentence Clifton for his horrific crimes.
The judge insisted, quite rightly, he'd be brought up for sentencing, and he wasn't for going quietly. And it took 9 prison officers a long time, having to have him wrap him in sheets to stop him kicking and punching and biting the officers, and they carried him up to the dock where he heard the sentence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment twice over for each of the murders and 4 years for stealing the car. The family who'd sat throughout the trial listened to the dreadful things that happened to their relatives, and I think they were very relieved at the outcome of the trial and the fact that he was going away, hopefully forever.
It was the most shocking and demanding investigation Lancashire police had ever seen, but finally it had come to an end.
The chain of events, working backwards from the siege to the escape from the balcony, the fact that it was a double murder, the fact that it was a manhunt, I just don't think that anybody could have written a credible script that could have fitted our scenario.
We knew we weren't far away, and we knew if we kept going, then eventually we'd get him, and we did.
After 3 months playing cat and mouse with the police, a sensational escape and a hostage situation, Terry Clifton would be an old man if and when he was ever released. And finally, the town of Morecambe could start trying to get back to normal.
With 5-star reviews across the board and immense performances from Jodie Foster and Kaylee Reese, True Detective Night Country is available now on Sky Atlantic.
I mean, I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
I was shielded from the raw details.
It did change the village at the time.
As a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
On the morning of the 30th of October 1966, a discovery was made that was to plunge the village of Beenham into a nightmare that its inhabitants would have to live with for nearly half a century. The village of Beenham in Berkshire is only 51 miles from London, but in 1966, this rural community may as well have been 1 million miles away.
Back in the 60s, we all knew each other. It was more tight-knit than it is now. It's still a very close village and everyone knows each other and looks out for each other.
In the 1960s, Beenham would have been a quiet village. We never got called up to there for any problems at all.
Early in the morning of Saturday, the 29th of October in 1966, police received a call about a missing 17-year-old au pair called Yolande Waddington.
Yolande had only been working at the farm as an au pair for a matter of days before she went missing and was then reported missing by her employer.
At the same time, a discovery was made on land belonging to the farm where Yolande was a nanny.
Some clothing was found in a barn. by one of the farm workers. He thought no more of it because previously other clothes had been found there. It was a location used by courting couples.
Unaware of the clothing, police spread the word about the missing 17-year-old.
The following day, further items of clothing were also found within the barn when farm workers went and moved some bales of hay. At that point, Yolande had been reported missing, so the fact that the clothing was found in the barn, reasonably close to where she was living, raised suspicions, and her employer was called to the scene.
It didn't take long before everyone's worst nightmares were realised.
On 30th of October, a body was found by her employer in a ditch close by to the barn where her clothing was found. She was naked, or almost naked. Her hands had been tied behind her back with twine, or baling twine. She had an item of clothing wrapped around her face and stuffed into her mouth. She had an injury to her rib cage just below her left breast, and she also had baling twine wrapped around her neck. It was that what killed her.
1966 was a time before DNA and databases. All they had was good old-fashioned police work.
It was obvious from the outset that it was a murder, and it was treated as such.
Rodney Watson and Gary Deacon were local PCs at that time.
A telephone call came in to the effect that a body had been found in a ditch in a farm track at Beanham. It was quickly established that we had received a report of a missing girl called Yolande Waddington, and as a result, I, amongst others, went to the scene to secure the scene.
Murders weren't known in those days as such, so everybody was sort of rushing around trying to get things organised, and I had to go to sort of do the search that was going to be taking place at the scene. We were greeted with open fields, rural tracks, the barn down the road, and farm tracks, and basically all rural area. We were searching at the time with sort of what would be garden instruments, the rake, hose, garden forks, shears for cutting the grass.
The atmosphere at the scene was quite sombre. Obviously, it was realised that the body in the ditch was a female and matched the description of Yolande Waddington, and she'd obviously passed away.
You'd read about it in textbooks and everything, and you'd done it at a training school, but to be actually involved in a murder search was an experience.
I actually conveyed Yolande Waddington to the Royal Berkshire Hospital, to the mortuary. I mean, I was thinking, you know, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
Identified by her employer, police were dispatched to give Yolande Waddington's family the horrific news. Giles, Yolande's younger brother, was 8 in 1966.
But I do recall this picture of opening the front door and finding a policeman in his full sort of uniform standing in front of me going, "I need to speak to your mum and dad." And that's the only real record I have. And then I have recollections of lots of people being in the house that were a bit unusual. And I would assume, in that case, there were various detectives.
This had been Yolande's first job away from the family home in Newbury, and despite only being in Beanham a few days, she was known as a friendly, talkative girl. News of the murder travelled through this country village fast.
I can remember the police presence. There were suddenly lots of policemen everywhere. When you came out of school or if you went to the village shop, there were policemen around, and it is quite memorable, something like that. It did change the village at the time then.
Berkshire was really a rural county, and apart from the normal problems that you had, maybe the occasional pub fights at the weekend, murders were unknown as such.
A call was made to London.
In 1966, it was standard practice for the Berkshire Constabulary to request the assistance of a Detective Chief Superintendent and a Detective Sergeant from the Metropolitan Police.
And it was felt that Metropolitan officers had the necessary experience and expertise in order to lead on these rare and serious offences.
With Scotland Yard on the scene, the investigation continued.
In the following days, a thorough search took place of the barn in the immediate area. Various items were seized. Sacks from within the barn, Yolande's clothing, a comb was found, a knife was found, which was believed to have been the knife that caused her injury.
The items were sent to the Metropolitan Police Lab in London for analysis, and then officers concentrated on piecing together Yolande's final movements.
Yolande Waddington was last seen on Friday the 28th of October 1966 in the Six Bells public house, Beanham. She got in there to buy a packet of cigarettes. She appears to have smoked one of the cigarettes within the bar and then left. That was the last time she was seen. It was always felt, I believe, that the offender would have lived in and around the Beanham area because of the isolated nature of where Yolande was found and the fact where she was last seen within the village centre. And therefore, investigators felt that the answer to who was responsible laid within the village. Everyone within the village was interviewed. The inquiry centred on who was within the Six Bells at the time she was, who left shortly after she did, and if they did leave, where did they go?
During their inquiries, officers began unearthing information that could prove crucial to capturing Yolande's killer.
The landlady of the Six Bells was interviewed. She remembers selling a packet of cigarettes to a girl fitting Yolande's description. A man by the name of David Burgess was in the pub at the same time Yolande was there. He'd been there the majority of the evening and left shortly after she did.
Just days after the brutal murder of teenager Yolande Waddington, police already had a suspect. In 1966, the rural village of Beanham in Berkshire was left reeling when the body of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington was found naked and strangled in a farm ditch. Local police had been bolstered by the arrival of the Met Scotland Yard. Items belonging to Yolande found at the scene had immediately been sent for analysis, and after a few days, they already had a suspect, a local man called David Burgess.
He was of interest because he was in the pub, the Six Bells, at the time Yolande was there, and left shortly after she did. The following day, he was seen with scratches on his face. He stated that he'd fallen into a bush on his way home. Police spoke to him. He stated he had been in the Six Bells and then had walked home from the Six Bells.
With nothing else to go on, 19-year-old local lad David Burgess was released, and the investigation moved on.
Everyone within the village was interviewed to establish where they were on the Friday that Yolande went missing.
Over the next few weeks, the usually quiet village of Beanham was a hive of police activity as they hunted Yolande's murderer.
I can remember the parents being really quite concerned of us kids going out to play, and the people in the village were quite scared.
At the time, our school was just down at the end of the lane there, and we used to just run up the lane and round and home. But once this happened, then all the mums were always at the school to meet us and walk us home. The police presence outside the hall, they were always there every day, which was obviously quite strange for Beanham to have so many police around. There's always ripples to any murder, but in a very small community, I think that those ripples are felt very, very keenly. Immediately, you start to look at your neighbour and feel suspicious, and immediately there's a fear
and a fear of people who are close to you and known to you. This is not the kind of thing that happens to us. It's the kind of thing that we read about in newspapers or we watch in plots on TV or in Hollywood films.
After almost 2 weeks of inquiries, where over 1,000 statements were taken, Yolandi's clothing and effects had been analysed. The results were to send the investigation in a direction that would end up making history.
During the investigation at the barn, her jumper was found. On that jumper was blood. When that blood was examined, it was found not to be hers. Following that, it was decided to request blood from every person, every male, over the age of 16 that lived in and around Beenham.
This was a bold move by police, as the science behind it was in its infancy.
Limitations of forensic science testing in the 1960s basically revolved around the limitations of testing for blood. We knew that there were 4 blood groups, and you could break it down a little bit more, but you could never rule somebody conclusively in as a suspect. You could only rule them conclusively out.
Progress, though, had recently been made.
In 1966, 2 forensic serologists working for the Metropolitan Police came up with what they thought would be a new technique that could be used for forensic applications. The new application would help to further distinguish individuals on the basis of their blood.
By early November 1966, police decided to push on with what became the first mass blood screening ever attempted in the UK.
Posters were put around the village inviting men over 16 to give blood, and also showing a knife similar to the one found in the barn. Following the publication of those photos, David Burgess approached an officer within the village and told him that he had once to own a knife very similar to that.
Yolande's murder would have been very big news in a very small village. So here is a concerned citizen who is giving police information about a knife that they've recently lost. That's very helpful, but it becomes slightly more suspicious when you also factor into account that Burgess was also the last person to see Yolande alive.
Before a single blood sample had been taken, David Burgess had re-emerged as the police's main suspect.
David Burgess was arrested in interview. He stuck to his story. The fact that he was in the pub, he couldn't dispute that because other customers had seen him. And the scratches, he explained those by saying he'd fallen into a bush on his way home because he'd had too much to drink.
Despite letting him go again, David Burgess, who worked at the local gravel pits and was already known to the police as a troublemaker, soon became the subject of gossip amongst the local bobbies.
I was kept abreast of things through snippets of colleagues who were undertaking the parts of the inquiry teams, and it became obvious that David Burgess was the chief suspect, although it was proving difficult to back up his claims with actually corroborative evidence.
Frustrated they couldn't prove Burgess's guilt, police continued looking into other local men.
My dad actually got arrested for the murder for Yolande, because what happened was the bus stop used to be outside the Six Bells pub, and he was in the pub and he had a Land Rover, and he said to her, because it was tipping down around, sit in my Land Rover while you wait for the bus. And somebody must have clocked that, and he got arrested and taken in, but he, in the next day, was released, so they know he never done it.
There were 16 men that were of particular interest to the investigation. However, one by one, those men were eliminated.
With the investigation floundering, police still had what they hoped would be the ace up their sleeve. On November the 23rd, 1966, blood samples were taken from every male between the ages of 16 and 50 living in Beenham.
In excess of 200 men had their blood taken. The type of blood grouping that was done was new.
This case was certainly one of the first times that mass blood screening was used. The most well-known instance happened in the 1980s, but this predates it by at least 20 years.
Police were hoping that identifying whose blood was on Yolande's jumper would lead them to her killer.
They were able to say that only 2% of the population would have had blood of that type, and that was borne out by the fact that out of in excess of 200 men that gave their blood, only 4 people had the same blood grouping as that found on Yolande's jumper.
Police were desperately hoping David Burgess was one of them.
It wasn't his blood on the jumper, or his blood didn't appear to match the grouping that was found on Yolande's jumper, so there wasn't a great deal more that the police could do. With the 4 men whose blood matched the grouping of the blood found on Yolande's jumper, they were all subject of intense investigation. All of them had alibis for what they were doing, and therefore were ruled out of the investigation.
It had been a massive gamble to take this unprecedented step in the investigation. Unfortunately, it hadn't paid off, and the police were back to square one.
The investigation were obviously limited as to what they could do forensically. They did all they could in relation to try and show who was at the scene with Yolande, but back in 1966, they couldn't progress it.
With no new evidence coming to light, there was a difficult decision to make.
The investigation finished in March 1967. The officers had done all they could to try and establish who was responsible for Yolande's death, but unfortunately, after almost 6 months, they had no evidence that could be used to charge someone with her death.
I imagine that the killer would be feeling that they'd gotten away with it, they'd been successful, and they'd be feeling quite a thrill from that. They'd be feeling empowered and invincible.
The investigation was never officially closed, and suspicions remained about David Burgess. But for now, the evidence from the scene was stored for future analysis. Despite all the police's efforts, the murder of Yolande Waddington remained unsolved. After 6 months, the investigation into the murder of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington had been stopped. The village of Beenham looked as if it was going to be living with a killer on the loose for the foreseeable future. Inquiries may have ended, but despite there not being a match in the UK's first mass blood screening, local troublemaker David Burgess remained the police's prime suspect. This was a village on the edge. On the 17th of April 1967, the village of Beenham hit the news again.
We've got another call come in to say that 2 9-year-old girls hadn't returned home after going out to play in the village of Beenham. And we all thought, no, this cannot be. Surely nothing's happened to them. But I attended with a lot of officers, probably 20 to 30, and volunteers from the village. And we searched the area by some gravel pits, and having been issued with the whistles to blow if anything was found, after about half an hour or so, somebody blew a whistle.
The whistle could mean only one thing.
When the call came in to say 2 bodies had been found, then you get a bit disheartened, you think, how sad. And it was a lonely area, these 2 young children as they were out there on their own, and something had happened. Devastating, really, yes.
The awful news reverberated around the village.
We were really in shock, and the teachers were in shock, parents were in shock, and it was really quite scary, actually.
Police quickly got to work. They were determined that this murder would not go unsolved.
It was obvious that these 2 girls had been murdered, so an investigation took place.
It wasn't long before police had a person of interest, and the name didn't come as much of a surprise.
Because David Burgess was one of the main suspects in Yolande's case, the fact that he worked so close to where the bodies of the 2 9-year-olds were found made him a strong suspect almost from the outset. He was interviewed, his clothing was seized, and from one of his boots some blood was found, and that blood grouping matched one of the girls.
David Burgess was charged with the monstrous killing of the two 9-year-old girls, Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams.
We'd heard that Burgess had been arrested on the possibility of committing the murders of the two schoolgirls, and I suppose we were all really delighted.
In July of 1967, just 4 months after the horrific killings of Jeanette and Jacqueline, David Burgess was presented at Reading Crown Court accused of their murder. It was a swift, uncomplicated hearing.
Burgess stood trial and was convicted of both the murders of both 9-year-olds in July 1967.
Escorted to his life sentence by Rodney Watson, Burgess's behaviour was, under the circumstances, bizarre.
And I was handcuffed to him in the dock, but most of the time he didn't really seem worried about what was happening. He kept on looking round, occasionally laughing, chuckling to himself, and not really worried about proceedings. And a very strange person I found to be in that position. I would have been worried myself. And then he was remanded in custody and then taken down and then released into the prison authorities. And that was the last time I ever saw him, in fact.
Now, I know that when I assess psychopaths, some of the things that I look for are callousness, lack of empathy, but just a general blunting of emotional response and effect. Now, here is somebody who is acting very oddly indeed. We know that he's not got a mental illness, but you have to question what else is going on.
Rodney's macabre introduction to the darker side of police work was over. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Who had murdered Yolandi Waddington? In 1968, a potential answer came from prison.
David Burgess admitted to being responsible for causing Yolandi's death to a prison officer, and that prison officer subsequently made a statement to police.
Could the man who police had always suspected of Yolandi's depraved murder be confessing?
On April 3rd, 1968, Burgess was interviewed in prison by police officers in relation to the admissions he'd made concerning Yolandi's death. To those officers, he said words to the effect of, "You'll have to prove it."
The fact that somebody was prepared to indulge in this sort of conversation and admissions and them saying you prove it as if it was some sort of game, totally disrespectful to the girl and the family and the family of the two other girls.
In talking about Yolandi's murder and taking responsibility for that murder, Burgess is meeting two needs. First of all, he's letting people know how clever he is because he's got away with murder. But also, crucially, he's re-engaging with that murder and re-engaging with the emotions that that murder brought about in him. So he's feeling powerful, he's feeling a thrill. And let's face it, when you're incarcerated, there are very few other outlets for that type of thing. If you can't commit a murder, you talk about a murder.
Police decided to test Burgess's blood one more time.
Following his admissions, the jumper was tested yet again in relation to the blood found, and a report was submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions. However, the blood grouping still didn't match that of Burgess, and as a result of that, the Director of Public Prosecutions stated that he didn't believe it was worthwhile pursuing the charge against Burgess.
It was a bitter blow, and it was looking like Yolandi's murder was never going to be solved. In 1996, 48-year-old convicted double child murderer David Burgess absconded from open prison.
At one point, Burgess was on the run for in the region of 18 months and took over the identity of someone that he knew that had died. Was subsequently arrested when he committed an armed robbery. We don't know where he was throughout the 18 months.
Sexual offending by its nature is addictive, and here is an individual who would be at very high risk of reoffending. But that's not to say that other murders would be inevitable, although they are possible.
When I heard that he'd escaped from an open prison, my thoughts were, how could somebody who's killed two 9-year-old girls be deemed safe to allow out into the public.
By February 1998, David Burgess was back in prison, whilst Beanham tried to get back to normal. But the village always had a cloud hanging over it.
There's a very good history of Beanham, which was written by the local history group some 10 years ago now, but it doesn't mention the murders.
It was a subject that was almost taboo.
I would say I would very rarely hear anyone talking about it here in the pub.
As many tried to forget, Giles, Yolande's younger brother, was just finding out the full horror of what had happened to his sister.
I discovered a pile of press cuttings hidden away out of view. Obviously being put away so that I didn't find them, but I did, and there was a sort of Yolande's photograph plastered on the front page, and there was sort of police and other sort of articles. So I found out a little bit to know that my sister had been murdered.
With David Burgess safely back behind bars, advances were being made in DNA analysis, meaning previously unsolved murders were worth revisiting.
In 1985, research published at the University of Leicester proved that new DNA analysis techniques could be used to link specific individuals to offences, and has since been used in many different capacities to solve homicides and sexual assault cases.
This breakthrough led to cold case units being set up by police forces around the country.
I retired in 2007 and then came back in my current role as a member of police staff, reinvestigating historic cases.
Eventually, in September 2010, the Thames Valley Major Crime Review Team turned their attention to the unsolved murder of Yolande Waddington.
So with Yolande's case, we initially looked at what the case was about, looked at what case papers we had, and importantly what exhibits we had, and did an audit of those exhibits to see what was still in existence, and then did an assessment as to what potential there was to use new forensic techniques on those exhibits.
Could advances in forensic sciences finally help police find Yolande's killer 44 years after her murder? Up until 2010, the 1966 murder of Yolande Waddington remained unsolved, despite the police believing that double child murderer David Burgess had been responsible from the very beginning. Then Thames Valley Police decided to reopen Yolande's case to see if DNA could identify and convict her killer. The new investigation began by finding out what evidence had survived.
We had items that were found in the barn, some items of her clothing, but importantly, what was missing was the oatmeal jumper that Yolande was wearing at the time of her death. That was an item from which a bloodstain was found, which wasn't hers, and it was that bloodstain, the grouping from that bloodstain, which was used on the initial investigation to get the blood grouping with which to match against people from within the village.
As the only item belonging to Yolande with someone else's blood on it, the missing jumper was a big blow.
There were another key items that still did exist, and it was those that we were able to submit to the forensic laboratories for further work to take place.
By January 2011, police managed to recover Yolande's headband and a plastic fertiliser bag. Now it was up to the lab to find DNA not belonging to Yolande.
We here at LGC have a cold case team that is dedicated just to cold cases. We'll use whatever available technology is there in order to try and help solve the case.
Locating the evidence was only half the battle. Usable DNA needed to be found.
One of the most important items was the polythene fertiliser bag that was found at the scene of the crime. Because the original note suggested there was blood on there, and obviously they'd got blood grouping results from that item. So we went back to it, and sure enough, there were still crusty blood stains on that item. We then sampled some of those stains and carried out DNA profiling on them, and got a good profile.
The lab was quick to give Thames Valley Police the news.
And they said that they had a profile. That profile, a DNA profile that is, that profile was then searched against the National DNA Database, and there was a match against David Burgess.
Already in prison for double murder, David Burgess was in the frame again. But it did pose the question, why hadn't he been a match when he was tested in 1966 or 68?
I would have expected him to match it, if the test had been carried out correctly. And unfortunately, we can't go back and recheck that particular test, and we don't have any documentation in order to see whether there might have been a transcription error, a problem in moving information of the actual type onto another page that was used in a report, for example.
As far as the team were concerned, Burgess's blood had been incorrectly categorised in the 60s. But persuading a jury of this wouldn't be easy. They had to use the DNA to prove that the blood had always belonged to Burgess.
Although it was good evidence to have Burgess's DNA on that sack, the problem we had was that he was a local young man, would have had ready access to that barn, so we had to get evidence over and above that, because potentially he could have just said, yes, that's my DNA, I'm local, so what?
Roy Green and his team at LGC continued investigating the evidence.
As we looked through the old case notes that were prepared over 40 years previously, we noticed that one of them, the headband, had a description of it saying grubby, and that was it. But on examining the item, we found that what were thought to be grubby marks were actually blood. The DNA profiling results showed that there was a mixture of DNA on the headband. Some of it could have come from Yolandi, and that's to be expected because it was her item. But also, some of it could have come from David Burgess.
If Burgess's DNA was definitely on the headband, it would show that he'd come into direct contact with Yolandi. Police had to prove beyond any doubt that the DNA was his.
We had to refer to a specialist in genetic statistics at UCL, and he was able to say that, in his opinion, the DNA profile found on her headband was a 1 in a billion match probability to Burgess.
A 1 billion to 1 match was conclusive proof that Burgess and Yolandi had had physical contact. It was time to let the surviving members of Yolandi's family know what was happening.
I tend to try and only make contact with the family when we have new evidence, which hopefully will bring their case to a successful conclusion. In Yolandi's case, I approached Giles, her brother.
There wasn't a sort of sense of relief, a sense of... I can't say that I felt anything. It's a process, and it still feels as though it's a process, because it makes no difference to the end result. Yolandi is dead, never to be alive again. The bit that I was worried about was the impact it would have on my dad in his twilight days.
For the police, turning failed investigations around wasn't just about pride.
Each one of our undetected cases has obviously a victim and the victim's family. The impact on families is massive, in as much that it's difficult to comprehend what that family's gone through. And when we visit them sort of 10, 20, 30 years after the event, you can still see the impact, in as much that there's a picture of their loved one, either on the television, on the mantelpiece, and it never goes away. It's something that they think about every day.
My parents were certainly not wanting a repeat. Well, their trust in anybody disappeared, evaporated completely, for the simple reason that their precious daughter had been taken from them.
Pete Byrne and his team had to put together a case to back up the DNA.
It's really, really pleasing to get the forensic result, but that's just the start of it, really. From that moment on, we then have to look at the case and build the case up against Burgess.
Police had to painstakingly trawl through all the evidence from 1966 and find the original witnesses.
They were all seen, if they were still alive, interviewed, asked in relation to their initial statement, whether they wanted to add, alter or correct anything in relation to what they'd said back in '66 to what they could remember in 2011.
In November 2011, the prime suspect in 17-year-old Nanny Yolandi Waddington's murder was interviewed about some of the original evidence from 1966 that had implicated him.
Did you get those scratches because Yolandi scratched your face?
I had nothing whatsoever to do with her death. I've told you that, and you won't believe it because I'm a liar, you said. We're saying the knife that you lost is identical. You say you lost. Is identical to the knife that was used to murder Yolanda Waddington. That's a coincidence, Sam, isn't it? Your missing knife is the same knife. How many people in Venham had a knife similar? How many people? Are they all suspects, aren't they?
Finally, Burgess was asked about his confession to prison guards.
And you thought it was safe to say that here?
No.
It was safe, wasn't it?
I'd never say something like that if I committed a murder. I wouldn't go around shouting about it.
After we finished interviewing Burgess and he was charged, we then carried on building the case up against him, putting the file in to the CPS, and then getting ready for the trial.
45 years after he'd first been the main suspect in Yolandi Waddington's brutal killing, David Burgess was going to stand trial for her murder.
It's not every day that you get told that your sister's murderer has just been arrested. It was a sort of sense of, wow, that's progress, and significant progress.
On the 18th of June 2012, David Burgess stood trial at Reading Crown Court.
I was confident in the results that we'd obtained, but in the background there was always this mistyping of the original blood grouping results that could be a potential stumbling block.
If the defence could sway the court into believing there was no way that the two blood tests done on Burgess in the 60s could have been wrong, he'd get off the murder of Yolandi yet again. It was a difficult time for Giles.
There is no provision whatsoever for, or any preparation that can prepare anybody for facing a trial as a victim's relative.
For David Burgess, it all seemed nothing more than an inconvenience.
I saw him throughout the trial. His attitude didn't seem to have changed at all from when we'd first interviewed him. He just simply appeared bored by the whole proceedings.
The jury and Giles were told all the grisly details.
The fact that she'd been found naked, her clothes had been strewn about, she'd been stabbed, she'd been strangled, the whole thing had been a sexual crime. And that's the bit that was uncomfortable because I found it out for the first time.
Through expert witnesses, the prosecution explained how the original blood tests must have been wrong, and more witnesses called.
One of the key points of the trial was a witness that we'd located in Australia who was living in Beanham just prior to the murder. She gave evidence to the effect that Burgess had attacked her one evening prior to the attack on Yolandi. We were able to use that evidence, what's called bad character evidence, put that before the jury to show the type of man Burgess was.
Once all the witnesses found by Pete Byrne and his team had given evidence, there was only the DNA left.
We're fortunate that the scientist was able to explain to the jury in layman's terms what that DNA consisted of and how he was confident that the DNA that was found on the items belonged to Burgess.
In the end, everything relied upon the jury understanding the complex evidence.
The trial lasted 5 weeks in total. The jury were out for 5 days, after which they came back with an 11-1 majority verdict that Burgess was the killer.
On the 23rd of July 2012, almost half a century after Yolandi Waddington's murder, David Burgess was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. It was a huge relief to Giles.
For want of the better expression, shouted from the rooftops to say, no matter how old the crime, the resources are now there to provide justice now.
He should be 92 years of age when he's released. I don't think he should ever be released.
Burgess is clearly a sexually motivated repeat killer, and you do wonder how his killing career would have been progressing had he not been caught. But as a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
We're very, very pleased that we got the result, but that's what me and my team do. We reinvestigate the historic cases that are unresolved.
Burgess was sent back to prison, but questions were raised about the 18 months he'd been on the run.
We made sure that forces were also made aware of the fact that there was a convicted killer that potentially could have committed offences anywhere within the UK within that time, so we passed on his details to other forces.
By the time Burgess is eligible for parole, he will have spent 73 years behind bars for the 3 murders the police know he's committed. The question is, are there more?
Join the team and face the day-to-day struggle of stamping out crime. Leave it to the experts. Saturday at 10 in the Force Northeast.
Please, how can I help? There was a 999 call received from dog walkers that had found a suitcase on a lay-by just near the road.
People came across a suitcase and opened it, and inside was the remains of a person.
Local people found it extraordinary that such an incident could happen here.
For a murder to happen, not only a murder, but a murder on this scale, it was absolutely shocking for the community.
We had knowledge that he had over £270,000 worth of debt, and he was struggling to pay off those debts.
There was blood absolutely everywhere in that room, on the sofa, on the walls and on the ceiling.
Through extreme measures, he used the alternative of planning the murder of his friend.
Tintwistle is an idyllic village nestled on the edge of the Peak District.
Tintwistle is a typical Peak District village. It's got a mixture of beautiful stone cottages. It's on the banks of the Longdendale Valley, and behind it are the Tintwistle Moors, known as the Nar and the Lower Moor. And it has stunning views over the Longdendale Valley and the 5 reservoirs.
A very parochial village where people can leave your back door open, no problems.
In Tintwistle, everyone knows each other. It's a very, neighbourly feel. It's a very close-knit community.
We've got a lot of people who have a lot of very good neighbours, and I think everybody supports each other.
In terms of crime rates in Tintwistle, it's fairly, non-existent.
But all this is about to change when the peace is shattered early one morning.
On the 10th of October, there was a 999 call received from dog walkers that had found a suitcase on a lay-by just near the road.
The location was on a main road that went between Manchester and Sheffield, and it dipped down a little bit into Derbyshire. It was a car park off the main road, but it was an area that was quite popular for walkers.
As you come into Tintwistle from the east, you go along what's called the Woodhead Pass, and this particular suitcase was dumped just over the wall as you go into the village beside the first reservoir.
As I remember, like this people passing by this lay-by and came across a suitcase and opened it, and inside the suitcase was the remains of a person.
Police are immediately dispatched to the area.
There's quite a long drive, really, from the point where I got the call to the point where I arrived at the scene. Just to give you some idea around the geography, when I first got the call, I was in Derby, which is here. The deposition site was all the way to the north of the county, to the north of Derbyshire, and as you can see, it's right at the very tip of the county.
Upon arrival, they are met with a gruesome sight.
It looks like the suitcase has been set on fire, and inside that suitcase we have a body of a man whose head has been removed, whose arms have been removed, and whose feet have been removed.
It was a Samsonite suitcase that was in an extremely charred state, but then it became apparent, and we had a human torso that had been extremely cruelly dismembered and burnt.
As a crime, this is really, really vicious. For somebody to remove all the limbs of a body, never mind commit the murder itself.
Derbyshire Constabulary launch a murder investigation, and news of the horrific find soon spreads around the village.
Oh, like chicken pox. Everybody talks about it, we all know about it. You go in the local shops. Have you heard?
In Tintwistle, it's a really neighbourly community. Everyone knows each other. You know, if there's gossip, someone down the road will know about it in 10 minutes or so. Considering the crime rate was fairly non-existent, for a murder to happen, not only a murder, but a murder on this scale, it was completely shocking for the community.
I think local people found it extraordinary that such an incident could happen here. I think, like all major crimes that happen in what everybody would regard as somewhere quiet and peace-loving, it adds to people's fear that something else could happen, or something else could happen as a result of it.
Police immediately cordon off the crime scene.
The big issue you've got here is you're out in the open. So there's two things. There's the weather, so rain can come and wash away your evidence. But secondly, you've got the issue of privacy. This is a really busy road, there's lots of traffic coming through, and you need to protect the privacy of that individual. That's really important.
Really what you want to do is secure and preserve as much evidence as you can. So there would have been things like identifying where the scene is, making sure that it was cordoned off, that there was enough police officers to ensure that nobody stumbled across the scene.
Beyond the scene, you might be looking at further searches. Has anything discarded, any clothing, any weapons, etc. So this particular point is very important from a forensic point of view. So you would want to be able to get some of your experts down, you want your crime scene manager, you'd really want your pathologist to be coming down to having a look at the scene, just so they have a full understanding of what's here, so that they can do a better job down the line.
And what I would do there is I'd have a discussion with the crime scene manager about the best way of removing the body to a hospital, but also making sure that we didn't lose any evidence while we were in that process, because the evidence that you might lose might be the only evidence that you get that helps you with the case.
Once you start moving a body, then the issue there is a potential loss of evidence, so there'll be some sampling requirements there and then, even in the circumstances where a body's been burnt. For example, there may well be fibres that have been transferred from the offender to the body, or alternatively to the suitcase, that haven't been damaged. It's really important to pick those up at that point.
The body is removed, and police focus on one thing.
But I think when you look at the wider picture around this is somebody's life. This is that they've lost. And, you know, what I really want to do is find out who the family is, who are the relatives and the friends of this individual, and they need informing at the earliest opportunity.
This was going to be a huge challenge for the police now because there's absolutely nothing to go by. They've just found a torso. There's nothing to identify the person, no fingerprints.
When you're looking at the difficulty presented by not being able to make an identification, the first things that we considered were things like the police database, and then we started looking at people who were missing, but because we had quite a wide geographical area, it was looking at people who were perhaps missing from West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, as well as Derbyshire. But it's an arterial route, could have been from anywhere.
With very little to go on, the pressure is on for the police to try to identify the body.
You head towards the things that you are quite confident that will bring about an identification. But then when the obvious start to go, then it progressively becomes more and more difficult. And you start considering any other locations or any other information that you may get that you think will help you identify who this person was. So it made it a really difficult inquiry where we were having to be very, very precise around the investigative tactics that we used to try and find out who were the people who were involved.
Whilst the police await lab results from the pathologist's examination of the body, their attention turns to other lines of inquiry.
So the first point of call for the police now would have been to conduct local inquiries, asking people if they'd seen anything, if they'd heard anything.
When these things initially happen, all sorts of stories start to abound.
But the question on everybody's lips is, who is the victim?
Foremost in my mind was, there is a family somewhere whose loved one has been murdered, and they don't know about it.
In the picturesque Peak District, police have launched a murder investigation after an unidentified body was discovered in a suitcase which had been set alight.
So the condition of the body, when we found it, the head had been removed, both hands had been removed, and the feet had been removed. There were two things that I sort of realised quite quickly. One, that was a deposition site. That wasn't where the murder had taken place. That was where the body had been placed afterwards. And the second thing was, and it was around whether the victim and the offender knew each other. And I took the view that why would one take the steps to hide somebody's identity if they didn't know each other? So I sort of realised in my own mind that if I worked out who the victim was, I would be able to work out who the offender was. And if I worked out who the offender was, I'd be able to work out who the victim was.
Unable to identify their victim, police await the results of the post-mortem.
Slightly unusually, there was no cause of death. So this tells us that there was no marks or scars or any wounds on the body parts that we had recovered, and clearly the victim's head had been removed. When we looked at the information that we did have from the post-mortem, this was a light-skinned male, and that's all that we were able really to glean from that. From the post-mortem, there were no marks, scars, tattoos or anything that would have assisted us making an identification.
Police trawl the missing persons database for any clues as to who their victim could be.
At the time, there was a lot of missing persons cases, so this could have been absolutely anybody.
There's quite a lot of missing people reported every single day in Derbyshire. And it was a case of refreshing those every single day, because the person may not be reported on day 1 or day 2 or day 3, but every single day going through the detail of who those individuals were and seeing if we could make a connection between the body that we got and that person who was missing.
With little to go on, Derbyshire Constabulary hold a press conference.
The purpose of today's press conference is to ask for the public's help to identify the victim.
We are working with other forces to ascertain whether our victim may have been reported missing in a neighbouring county, but we recognise that he might not have been reported missing at all. We are therefore asking members of the public to come forward if they have not seen a neighbour or a friend or a colleague, or indeed any members of their family recently. A special call centre has been set up to take calls from across the UK, and we are urging people to provide information in relation to this murder investigation.
Information soon starts to filter into the police.
It became apparent that a number of dog walkers had seen the suitcase but hadn't realised exactly what was inside.
So in order to better understand the time frame that we're looking at and understand when the body may have been put in the car park, we did substantial inquiries with people who'd been on the road. We were asking for people who'd got dash cam footage or people that had driven past. And there were a few positive responses out of that, which were able to tell us that the fire had been set late the night before.
With 3 different drivers claiming to have seen a fire around 11:30 p.m. on the 9th of October, officers on the ground can now focus on who was in the area around that time, in a bid to identify the potential killer.
So that was really useful from the initial investigation point of view to be able to really narrow those timelines so you could concentrate on that time period and work out from there what the offender had done, where he'd been, where he'd likely to travel to and from.
Police now ramp up their inquiries.
There was a bolt out of the blue, and we got a conversation. We got a phone call in from South Yorkshire to inform us that there was actually an ANPR camera on the A628. So the phone call that we got on that day was, do you know you've got an ANPR camera on the 628? And no, we didn't. But thanks very much for telling us. That's really great.
Police immediately trawl through the automatic number plate recognition cameras to establish which vehicles had passed through the area on the night in question.
The police followed ANPR camera footage and located a Mercedes vehicle that triggered the camera just after 11 o'clock on Sunday the 9th, the evening before, and then didn't actually make it all the way across Woodhead Pass Road and to trigger the other ANPR camera at the other end.
It was the only vehicle that passed in the window of opportunity. So every other vehicle only went in one direction, either towards Manchester or towards Yorkshire.
All the vehicles, over 200 that had travelled along that road within the time period, down to one that had turned around and returned back to the Manchester area.
That was a strong indication that that vehicle was the one that deposited the body here on the night of the 9th.
After 10 days of round-the-clock investigations, and still having no clue as to the identity of their victim or suspect, this discovery is key.
The Mercedes triggered the camera on the evening before between 23:09 and 23:26. So straight away that was something I was very interested in, and we started to make some inquiries as to who might be the owner and what might be the significance of that vehicle.
This was absolutely key in the investigation. After 10 days of not finding anything, they needed to find out who this silver Mercedes belonged to.
As it happened, the vehicle didn't have any insurance, and so there was a reason to go and stop it and speak to the driver and have a look at the vehicle.
After further investigation, police discover that the vehicle is registered to someone living in Manchester.
So the owner of the vehicle was somebody called Ming Jiang.
Once the vehicle had been identified, it was registered to Ming Jiang, and therefore this triggered for the police to monitor him, make inquiries as to where he lived, inquiries of where he went.
There was so much pressure on the police. At this point in the investigation, it was very time sensitive. After 10 days, they really needed to find this person. At this point, the person who committed the crime could have run away, they could have covered up, or they could have very much so committed again.
Initial inquiries reveal Ming Jiang lives in Manchester, so Derbyshire Constabulary enlist the help of their colleagues over there.
When Greater Manchester Police assisted us, they were able to locate the vehicle, and because it was driven without any insurance, we were able to seize it. And when we seized the vehicle, we were then able to forensically examine it. And what I was looking for in that forensic examination was to find any evidence that might link to the body that we've got and the scene that we'd preserved some days before.
The police found a speck of blood in the rear that was the size of a 10p coin.
This was a really, really big moment in the investigation. What I would be looking to find out there is a blood spot in the boot of the vehicle the same as the blood that we found at the scene. So the DNA was sent away for comparison. It was the longest 24 hours I can imagine. Eventually it came back, and it came back with the news that we were really hoping for, and that was that the blood in the boot matched the DNA of the blood at the scene.
The blood match in the boot of the car puts Ming Jiang at the forefront of the investigation.
I felt this was the first time we were getting a breakthrough and first time we were getting an indication as to what may have taken place here. So as soon as we got the positive information about the DNA hit, it was a case of let's get this person arrested at the earliest opportunity.
So Ming Jiang was arrested on the 20th of October. They'd attended a casino in Manchester where they believed he was, and he was arrested at that location.
Now that the police have Ming Jiang in custody for questioning, time is of the essence to find evidence linking him to the murder.
What is also part of the inquiry is to start doing an evidential search around him to understand where he lived, what his movements were, and whether there was any other evidence that we'd be able to glean from his home address.
The police searched the home address and they found blood stains all over the carpet. There was blood dispersion across all of the walls. They had been painted over and quite a shoddy clean-up had taken place. It was an extensive clean-up, but there was still blood throughout the flat and in the bathroom.
There was traces of blood absolutely everywhere that weren't immediately apparent to the eye, but there were things like the blood had seeped through the laminate flooring. There was blood that was soaked into the cushions on the sofa. There was blood on the walls and on the ceiling.
So the scene was a really rich source of evidence for us. The main evidence we got were 2 finger marks in blood. So we got one under a table. The evidence you're really looking for there is the offender's fingerprint in the victim's blood. And getting that in 2 places was very, very critical evidence.
At this point, it's absolutely safe for the police to say that the murder took place in this apartment.
Ten days into the investigation of the body in the suitcase found in a Derbyshire village, police have discovered a car linked to the murder and have made an arrest.
A forensics team investigated the car. They swabbed the blood. This matched the torso that was found in the suitcase. So at this point, the police were then able to arrest Mr. Ming Jiang.
Forensic tests reveal the blood on the torso in the suitcase is a match for the blood in Jiang's flat in Manchester, making Ming Jiang their #1 suspect.
So the investigation moved over to Manchester because it became clear from the Derbyshire point of view that the offence had actually taken place in Manchester. As a result of their inquiries, that took them to the flats at Falconwood Way in Beswick. And as a result of what they found there, they felt very strongly that that was actually the place of the murder. And so as a result of that, that would then become a Manchester investigation.
But police are no closer to identifying their victim.
So as the inquiry goes on, the stress and the pressure builds. As a senior investigating officer, it's a privilege to do that role. but you do take the responsibility of having to investigate the death of somebody, and you owe that responsibility to the family of the victim. So I was really concerned about finding out who that was and getting that information to them at the earliest opportunity.
However, searches of their suspect and his car have led to a discovery.
When we did the evidential search of the Mercedes vehicle, we found some banking documents of another person called Yang Lu.
He had certain possessions on his person. At the time, he had his passport, he had his bank cards.
And that led us to an address in Salford at Media City. And there were some lines of inquiry that we needed to conduct at that address and find out what the relationship was with this person and how they fitted into the inquiry.
Police immediately sent officers to Yang Lu's address.
There was no answer, it was nowhere to be seen by anybody. So I made the decision that we were going to force entry into that apartment and find out really who this person was. So we forced entry into the address at Media City. Nothing particularly remarkable about the address, but what it did allow us to do was take some items from there which we knew the owner of that apartment would have left their DNA on. So very quickly we were able to send that away for analysis.
Finally, there is a breakthrough. Results come back matching Yang Lu's DNA to the torso, as well as the blood found in Ming Jiang's flat and car. Almost 2 weeks after the discovery, police have the name of their victim.
So what we did find out was that Yang Lu was a 27-year-old male, originally from China.
Yang Lu came to the UK in 2000 to study, where he went to the University of Leeds. His family actually worked really, really hard to save money so that he could study in the UK and achieve his goals and his dreams.
He finished his master's degree, and after that he stayed here and become a shares and stock trader.
He'd not brought any of his family with him over here, so if you look at the reasons why he may not have been reported missing, his family simply didn't know that he wasn't where he should have been.
Police now have the harrowing task of informing their victim's family.
This was a really difficult case from a family point of view. Under normal circumstances, we'd want to inform the family in person. And in the end, we actually had to make the call to the family in order to inform them. That's something that we wouldn't normally do under any circumstances, but unfortunately, with the distance involved, we had no other option. I arranged for contact through Interpol with the Chinese authorities in order to let the family know. In the meantime, we allocated family liaison officers in order that we could make the process as smooth as possible.
Yang's family were absolutely devastated when they found out, their only son had been murdered. Not only murdered, but in such a vicious way.
And then they arrived in the UK in the second week of November.
Yang was very close to his family. They spoke on the phone near enough every single day. He actually vowed to go back to China and look after his family if one of them was to fall ill. And I think that just shows the tight-knit relationship they have, because he'd built himself this fantastic life in the UK and he was really willing to give that up to go back and look after his family.
When the family was here, then I helped them in different ways because they can't speak English. So most of the time that if they have something do not understand about the police procedure, and I help to explain them.
They were completely grief-stricken. They had lost their only son, who had come to the United Kingdom to study at university. He was a very clever young academic man and a very bright young man, and they were deprived of their son.
With time running out to hold their suspect in custody, police need to work fast to build enough evidence to charge him.
Ming Jiang is a danger to the public, and we would really want to be in a position where he'd be charged at that point. The secondary issue is he's a big flight risk. We'd be worried about him kind of moving back to China or elsewhere.
We had to prove that he was the person that had committed that murder. We knew he was involved and could prove that to the extent, and we then had to build a case.
There's no doubt that Ming Jiang tried to cover his tracks quite extensively, but the problem is there was just too much evidence. The evidence there in particular was extremely strong. It's almost the best evidence you can find at a scene, which was Yang Lu's blood and Ming Jiang's fingerprint.
Police now believe Ming Jiang murdered Yang Lu in his flat, dismembered his body, and dumped his torso in a suitcase before setting light to it. But they need to work out the link between the pair and establish when the murder happened, so trawl CCTV footage in the days leading up to the discovery of the suitcase.
CCTV footage revealed a man getting off the tram in Manchester. He crossed the road to meet another man and they went in the direction of a flat in Beswick.
That tram stop was the closest one to where Ming Jiang's home address was.
The male he met up with perfectly fit the description of Ming Jiang. And in addition to that, we had telephone evidence that showed the two phones of Ming Jiang and Yang Lu came together. And interestingly, from that point onwards, the phones always remained together. And that was the very last time that Yang Lu was seen.
With the evidence building, police make a decision.
So I authorised one charge of murder.
Ming Jiang denies any involvement in the murder, so the police and prosecution need to build a case for trial and establish a motive, meaning they have to delve deeper into the lives of the two men.
Yang Lu was definitely a responsible young man. He invested in stocks and shares, and he knew how to make money. He was very clever in that sense. He'd built himself this brand new life in the UK. He really had a bright future ahead of him. Yang really enjoyed gambling. He was a very big gambler. He'd go to casinos quite often. He always gambled within his means, though. He was never irresponsible in that respect. Even though he had the money to gamble, he never went above and beyond.
So Ming Jiang was in a very different situation to Yang Lu. Ming Jiang was originally from China. He moved over to the UK. He lived in the Beswick area in North Manchester. He rented that flat. At the time of the murder, he really was in serious debt problems. He'd spent quite a long time at casinos. He was a regular gambler. In fact, so much so that he had VIP status.
We believe that they met in a casino when they share the same interest to gamble. They met in the Manchester casino.
But Yang Lu could never have imagined that their relationship could be so deadly.
Ming Jiang was very well known in the casino community. In some casinos, he had quite specialised status due to the large amounts of money that he was gambling. Yet in other casinos, he had markers on him due to his erratic and volatile behaviour. It was my understanding that he was a great fun guy to be around when he was winning, but it was a very, very different case when he was losing.
He lost a huge amount of money, and as far as we know, is sort of a £200,000 debt, and he's been chasing by the debtor, the creditor within the community.
It was the Crown's case that Ming Jiang had accrued extensive debts. We had knowledge that he had historically acquired over £270,000 worth of debt within 2 casinos. He was struggling to pay off those debts. We knew that he had pawned some wristwatches for over £15,000 to try and keep the debtors at bay.
Getting more and more desperate to pay off his debts, it appears Ming Jiang hatched an evil plan.
Ming Jiang was in huge amounts of debt. He had no income or wherewithal with which to repay that debt, and the only way he believed he could do that was either through his addiction of gambling and waiting for the big win, or through extreme measures. He used the alternative of planning the murder of his friend.
When the police found Ming Jiang, he was actually in possession of Mr. Yang Lu's passport and his bank cards. So at this point, it's safe to assume that he was trying to assume his identity.
So Ming Jiang had taken Yang Lu's life and then he took his identity. He basically used all his personal information in order to extract money through his bank cards. He even tried to sell his flat, and he was making good progress on that at the point at which he'd been arrested. There was nothing that he wouldn't do in order to extract as much money and value out of Yang Lu.
In Manchester, Ming Jiang's trial for the murder of Yang Lu begins.
So the trial was conducted in April of 2017. Shortly prior to the trial hearing, we did meet with the victims' parents, and we had to reassure them that we would do our utmost to be able to obtain justice for their son.
The court hears how Ming Jiang had a checkered history.
Ming Jiang was a Hong Kong national. Before he came to the UK, he was working as cabin crew for a German airline, where he was actually convicted for credit card fraud.
The police found that he had convictions in Germany for shoplifting, convictions for identity fraud and forgery of documents in Switzerland. He had convictions for credit card fraud in Scotland. So as a result of that, as the reviewing lawyer, it was my job then to write international letters of request. I had to make formal requests to Germany and Switzerland to obtain evidence of those convictions, which we then subsequently at the trial hearing submitted as evidence of bad character.
The prosecution believes Ming Jiang was planning to use his experience of identity fraud to build a new life for himself.
It appeared quite clearly that Ming Jiang understood his way around the financial system, and the kind of things that he did and the way that he adopted the identity, for example, by using Yang Lu's phone to contact banks, etc. That showed quite a little bit of knowledge of how to basically defraud and use identity theft to his advantage.
This was premeditated, it was planned. He had devised a plan as to how he was going to assume his victim's identity and obtain all of his assets and walk away. He was probably going to walk away from his debts, take what money he could get from his victim and return to China. I believe that would have been his plan.
The motive behind the murder was quite clearly greed. It was obvious that Ming Jiang understood that Yang Lu had a lot of money. He lived in a nice area of Manchester. He owned his own flat. He dabbled in stocks and shares, and the concept that they'd had together, we believe that there would have been some understanding from Ming Jiang's point of view that Yang Lu was pretty wealthy.
During the trial, Ming Jiang's story changes several times.
Ming Jiang showed no remorse whatsoever throughout the whole process. He came out with bizarre and incredulous accounts, changing the overall story on a number of occasions. Initially, he claimed that Yang Lu was an escort and that they were in a relationship. There was absolutely no evidence to support that.
So he wasn't consistent in his account that he was providing to the police. He did pursue that through to the trial hearing and maintained that it was a different Chinese male called Mr. Wong who had committed the act of murder, and he tried to distance himself by using this fictional character.
He later on claimed that there was a kind of third-party gangster-type individual who was involved that Yang Lu owed money to again, from an investigation point of view, we were able to show that that simply wasn't the case.
Ming Jiang fabricated Mr. Wong, and he gave the phone number to the police. However, when the police checked the record of the phone, and it's find out that the phone number is only created a date before they believed Liu Yang died.
So all the explanations that Ming Jiang provided were easily discounted and showed that he was just making things up as he went along.
The jury has shown CCTV from the night police believe Yang Lu was murdered in a bid to prove that Ming Jiang was the last to see him.
The evidence we used, we had a digital sequence of events that displayed all of the CCTV footage and the appropriate stills. So we had the stills showing that Ming Jiang was friends with the victim and that they had attended the casino together on the 3rd of October. And then subsequently, Ming Jiang had clearly lured him to his flat on the 5th of October, and we had a still digital photo of Yang Lu leaving the Metrolink tram stop at Velo Park, which was the closest one to Ming Jiang's home address.
From a CCTV point of view, that was the last point at which Yang Lu had been seen, so that was on the 5th of October.
So his movements shortly after the time that we believe that he had killed Yang Lu, he used the bank cards that he'd acquired. He used them at B&Q to purchase cleaning products, paint with which to paint the flat. He went to the petrol station on numerous occasions, and he was seen to be filling one, if not two, containers of petrol, which we then subsequently believe that he used to set the body on fire.
Having killed his supposed friend and made attempts to clean the evidence, it appears Ming Jiang goes back to doing what he loves best.
In the early hours of the 6th of October, Ming Jiang spent 30 minutes at the casino. He also spent time at the casino after the deposition. So in the early hours of the 10th of October, he spent around 4 hours. And if you can imagine, he literally just taken the torso of the body, he's dumped it up in Tinswhistle, and then he set it on fire, returned back to his flat, and the first thing he does is head to the casino to spend Yang Lu's money and gamble.
His actions aren't the actions of what you would expect a normal person to do. And it's a terrible thing to murder somebody. But then to murder somebody and dismember the body and then dump it and set on fire, it's just an incredibly callous act. And it probably speaks a lot about his character.
After hearing the evidence, the jury retires to consider its verdict.
So the jury in this case sat for 4 weeks, and under normal circumstances, you generally expect around about a day's deliberation per week. So under normal circumstances, it would take 4 days to come to a decision. But in this case, it only took them 4 hours, and that shows you really how overwhelming the evidence was.
After weeks of evidence is a very short period of time. And I believe would demonstrate that they were absolutely sure in a very short space of time that Ming Jiang was guilty of this offence.
At the point that they gave their verdict, Ming Jiang was completely emotionless. He showed nothing at all. At that point, he went back into custody, and sentencing took place a week later. The judge actually sentenced him in his absence because he refused to come to court.
The presiding judge made a point of stating that the starting point for a sentence would be 30 years due to it being solely the sole purpose being for gain, and in this case for money. However, he outlined aggravating features such as the extensive dismemberment of the body, the complete lack of remorse, and the misleading of evidence. And he made a point of saying that it might be that the authorities never deem him to be safe to be returned to the community, and that he could spend the rest of his life in prison.
On the 2nd of May, 2017, Ming Zhang is sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 33 years. He has never revealed the whereabouts of Yang Lu's limbs or head.
The saddest thing about this murder is Ming Zhang's greed caused the loss of the life of a young 36-year-old man, leaving behind two very grief-stricken, distraught parents.
His family didn't know the last time they spoke to him on the phone, the last time they saw him in person, was going to be the last time. I think, yeah, it's really devastating that they never got to say goodbye to their only son.
The killing of a grandmother, a mother and her two daughters sparked the biggest investigation Wales has ever seen, leading to 3 suspects within the police. The chilling Murder in the Valleys continues new Wednesday at 9.
My name is Kenneth. I'm 33 years old. I graduated from high school and joined my current company, where I'd been an idle employee at a rural branch for 15 years. When I was in middle school, my father passed away. I wanted to start working after middle school, but my mother, crying, begged me, please at least graduate from high school. Although I wanted to ease my mother's burden by working early, I decided to honor her wishes and attended high school. We couldn't afford college, and I thought taking a student loan would delay my working years by 4. So I begged my mother to let me work right after high school. My mother, understanding my feelings, said, in this era, having just a high school diploma might make life tough, but... Anne agreed. In high school, I worked part-time at a company run by my relatives. I had other part-time jobs too, but my relatives kindly employed me. I told my relatives I planned to work full-time after high school, so they taught me various professional manners. Though sometimes strict, I appreciated their guidance, knowing it was preparation for the real world. I am currently at a rural branch. I create internal newsletters and manage documents there. It's a so-called an idle position. Being assigned here means no chance of promotion. In fact, it's known that during layoffs, employees from this department are the first to be let go. Around me are people who cause trouble in other departments, have poor performance, or have frequent tardiness and absences. Essentially, problem employees. I didn't cause any trouble myself. I just caught the eye of a certain boss. There was a college graduate, Amy, 1 year younger than me, who joined the company after me. When I was still at the main office, we worked in the same department. Back then, I was 24 and she was 23. Amy was a very cute woman. She was popular in the company. And there was Kent, 2 years older than me. He was an elite graduate from Harvard, a famous university. Amy also graduated from Harvard, making them senior and junior. Apparently, when Amy was a freshman, Kent was a senior, and they had dated once. Kent boasted about it. However, another Harvard graduate said Kent's intense advances couldn't be rejected by Amy, leading to a brief 1-week relationship before Amy broke up with him. I was listening to all that talk with College graduates generally didn't care about those of us with just a high school diploma. There was a sense that they looked down on us. Being aware of this, I kept my distance from college graduates. However, I became Amy's mentor when she was a new hire. Though only 1 year older, I had 5 more years of work experience. It seemed fitting. People say I'm good at taking care of others. I tend to consider others' situations too much. When my father passed away, I also considered my mother's situation too much and offered to start working after middle school. I have a habit of prioritizing others over myself. Amy seemed to like this about me. She followed me around with a stool. It's common for newbies to follow their mentors around. So, I didn't think much of it. But one day, Kent called me out. "Hey, Kenneth. Don't get cocky." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. So, I asked him honestly. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. Apparently, my attitude irritated him. His face turned red as he said, "I know you've been following Amy around." "Amy? Who was that?" I remembered there was one person. "Are you talking about Amy?" "Yes. I heard you're using your position as her mentor to keep her close like your personal assistant." "What? What was he talking about?" I was dumbfounded. If she was following me around, that made sense. But me following her? How could anyone see it that way? And we only talk about work 99% of the time. The other 1% is just I'm hungry or what's the weather like tomorrow. Only talking about work would be awkward. It's a completely professional relationship. We only talk about work, I said. Don't lie. You're abusing your position. I'm going to report you to HR for misconduct. Go ahead. I believe Amy will clear my name during the investigation. I said. I truly believe that. A few days later, there was indeed an inquiry from HR, conducted by Henry. Both Amy and I answered normally. She said, "This seems strange. Are they questioning all new hires?" while tilting her head. I had an idea but said, "Who knows?" and tilted my head along with her. After a while, Henry called me directly on the internal line. "Kenneth, there's a report that you told Amy not to say anything that would be detrimental to you during the inquiry." "What?" I was shocked. I never said anything like that to Amy. "There must be a mistake," I said. "We received a tip," he replied. "Who said that?" "It's not true at all. I can't reveal the source. So, HR will have someone monitor you. Your boss has also been told to keep an eye on you." Okay. I hung up. I hadn't done anything wrong. So I should just continue as usual. But the thought of being watched made me uneasy. Not just that. Knowing my boss would be watching me with suspicion was unsettling. I had worked so hard for the company. It was frustrating, but I couldn't think of a way to prove my innocence. A few days later, Henry called me again. "Kenneth, we're removing you from your position as Amy's mentor." Excuse me? I was shocked. It was too sudden. Why? "We received information from your boss that you're using your position to manipulate Amy." What? My boss? Was it Curtis, the division manager, or Sage, the section manager? Or perhaps I had one person in mind. Was it Mark? Mark, the supervisor, was drinking buddies with Kent. They were peers and Mark became a supervisor right after Kent, who was the fastest to get promoted. They were close. Maybe they were colluding behind the scenes. I can't say who. But expect a formal notification from your boss. Okay. And if this happens again, there will be consequences. Understood? Understood. Amy, beside me, looked puzzled. She couldn't possibly imagine that I was being reprimanded by HR for supposedly abusing my power over her. My mind went blank. Then Sage called out to me. "As you probably heard from HR, we're removing you from your position as Amy's mentor. If anything like this happens again, I won't be able to protect you." What? Amy, beside me, looked surprised. "Amy, I'm sorry for not keeping a closer eye on things." "What do you mean?" "Amy, come with me. I'll be your mentor from now on." What? Mark grabbed Amy's hand as she stood confused. Seeing this, I realized it was indeed Kent and Mark who leaked the false information. I was forbidden from any interaction with Amy and was transferred to another department the next month. Several months passed. After work, Amy called me to meet at the emergency stairs. I didn't go. I continued working late and returned to the locker room around 8 p.m. 2 hours has passed after the end of work at 6 p.m. I didn't expect Amy to still be there. Amy. She was there. In the cold, her ears, cheeks, and fingers were red. She turned around at my voice. And she said happily, "Kenneth." I couldn't help but run to her. I handed her a can of coffee I had bought for myself. "Here, hold this. It's warm." Amy smiled, holding the can with both hands. "I'm glad you came." She did nothing wrong. Thinking that made my chest hurt. She was forbidden from talking to me without understanding why and called me out to find out the reason. I decided not to meet her because I didn't want to cause her more trouble or be falsely accused of anything else. I thought if I didn't show up at the agreed time, she would give up and go home. But she waited for me the whole time. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I apologized repeatedly, biting my lip. "Why do we have to go through this? We didn't do anything wrong. Amy, if someone sees us, it'll be bad. Let's part ways and go home." Why? Why are we in this situation? I don't know, but someone. At that moment, "What are you doing there?" Henry spotted us and raised his voice. I heard voices, so I came to check. "What are you doing on the emergency stairs?" "You are." Henry looked at me. "Aren't you Kenneth from the blacklist?" I was on the blacklist? It was over. Honestly, I couldn't think straight. Henry's outburst drew the attention of other HR staff working overtime nearby. From there, it was a blur. The story became that I was trying to do something to Amy on the emergency stairs. That incident led to my transfer to a rural branch the following week. Amy was given a few weeks off until I was transferred, so we didn't see each other again. I didn't know her personal contact details, and she didn't know mine. We were separated without being able to do anything. 9 years passed since then. I've been working as an idle employee at the rural branch ever since.